during which an estimated 3,000 Tamil people died and 150,000 were made homeless. During the pogrom, Tamil homes, businesses were targeted, with buildings looted and burned and widespread violence. As well as the cost to lives, what has come to be known as Black July led to the loss of around 8,000 Tamil homes and more than 100 industrial plants, more than 5,000 Tamil shops, and estimated over 300 million in wealth. The events of July 1983 proved to be one of the catalysts for the decades of civil conflict which followed. However, the pogrom itself was the culmination of decades of anti-Tamil policies and anti-Tamil violence in Sri Lanka, seeds which, if we consider the history, were sown back in the island's colonial era. From the Ceylon Citizenship Act in the 1940s, which left many Tamils stateless, to the deportation of many thousands of Tamils to India between the 1960s and 1980s, to the 1956 Sinhala Only Act, which recognised Sinhalese as the sole official language, replacing English and excluding Tamil. It is clear that for Sri Lanka's Tamils, the history is one of disenfranchisement, deportation, and policies which discriminate against that community's language and culture. Black July, therefore, was not an isolated event, but was part of a wider picture of persecution and cycle of violence. However, it is an event which continues to scar Sri Lankan society to this day. Many Tamils in the UK would now have arrived here after fleeing the 1983 conflict and will remember the events and violence keenly. In Sri Lanka, the pogrom had a devastating effect on the Tamil community, leading not only to the loss of thousands of innocent lives, but to the massive displacement of Tamil families who were forced to flee their homes, as well as causing injury and psychological trauma. Then, in 2009, the Sri Lankan government, under the pretext of fighting terrorism, killed thousands of Tamils, including children, who were sent to a small strip of land designated as a safe zone, where they were then bombed. Atrocities evidenced by satellite photographs. The Easter Sunday atrocities in 2019, and despite intelligence warning of the attacks, has still not seen anybody brought to justice. Now, all of these scars are deepened... Yes, certainly.
For giving way, and the experiences he describes are very well known to many of the Tamil constituents that I am lucky enough to represent. In particular, can I ask you about the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which is still in force today in Sri Lanka, and which is used arbitrarily as a means to discriminate against and intimidate the remaining Tamil community in Sri Lanka. Does he share my view that it is high time the British government took more decisive action to put pressure on the Sri Lankan government to end the use of that act?
I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention. We are on exactly the same page, although I will come to that section of my speech fairly shortly. I agree absolutely wholeheartedly with the comments that he has made. As I was saying, these scars are deepened by the fact that years later, the Sri Lankan Tamil communities are no closer to any meaningful accountability or justice for these terrible pogroms, and by the fact that many of the institutions and laws which enabled the violence remain in place today, and they are still responsible for the human rights violations occurring. Concerns remain about Sri Lanka's police force and armed forces, with allegations that they abuse their power in relation to surveilling and harassing human rights activists. Indeed, I have heard directly from Tamils that the outcome of the Sri Lankan Lessons Learned Reconciliation Commission was that the victims were further victimised by the Sri Lankan armed forces. Concerns remain too about the laws which enable human rights violations. The Prevention of Terrorism Act, which my colleague had asked about, has enabled the detention of political prisoners for long periods since it was enacted in 1979. It was this act which was used to detain the 53 prisoners at Welikada prison, who were subsequently killed during a terrible flashpoint in the Black July pogrom, which has come to be remembered as the Welikada prison massacre. The Prevention of Terrorism Act was used to arrest state opponents, and although it may now be repealed, there are fears that its proposed replacement, the Anti-Terror Act, may in fact be worse, and that the government's attitude towards human rights activists has not altered at all. Domestic attempts at accountability for the events of 1983, meanwhile, would appear to have failed. The Presidential Truth Commission on Ethnic Violence published its report in 2002, criticising the government for failing to hold perpetrators to account and for failing to appeal for restraint during Black July. The report recognised the pogrom as a violation of Tamil human rights and recommended compensation for the victims. However, the recommendations of this report have never been properly implemented, and not a single perpetrator has ever been prosecuted. The Sri Lankan government are now implementing another Truth and Reconciliation Commission. However, concerns remain that this provides no route to accountability and no proper witness protection mechanism. This would neither cater to the victims' needs nor adhere to international standards. Now, I am grateful to the Sri Lankan High Commission for providing me with a briefing update on reconciliation. It will take me some time to fully digest and consider the points made. However, I would like to highlight one of the first sections, the Office of Missing Persons, OMP. It states that the tracing unit found 16 persons alive and confirmed 3 deceased as of November 2023. And let me put that into context. It is believed that some 18,000 Tamils had been handed over to the army. So what happened to the rest? Where are they? And what records exist to tell us? Amnesty International identified that despite global pressure, serious human rights violations committed during the years of armed conflict remain unaddressed. The families of those forcibly disappeared continue to seek truth and justice. Now, these are facts which the UK government know and recognise. In the FCDO's 2022 Human Rights and Democracy report, the government noted that the Prevention of Terrorism Act was used to detain Sri Lankans for long periods, and that the UK continued to call for the government of Sri Lanka to replace the PTA with human rights compliant legislation. The report also noted that security forces faced accusations of serious human rights violations. The government concluded that there has been little credible progress on transitional justice before promising that the UK will continue to advocate for improved protection of human rights in Sri Lanka. Yes, certainly.
And congratulate him on securing this important debate, which many of my constituents would also concur with concerns about human rights violations, including access to clean drinking water as a human rights violation. Does he share my concerns of reports that the Sri Lankan government has refused to allow independent assessments of water quality in northern Sri Lanka, and agree that the Sri Lankan government must ensure all citizens of that region, who are mostly Tamils, have access to clean drinking water, and anyone affected by contamination be provided with medical care and be compensated adequately, as a little known but very important human rights violation as well?
I'm grateful for the honourable member making that point. You're correct, it is little known, and you have educated myself in making it. I would concur with your assessment, and it's, as is often the case, it is the poorest and least advantaged that are most disadvantaged in these situations. As I was saying, as a broad statement of intent, the government's position is welcome. However, the UK could and should go further. The Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice has called for the Sri Lankan government to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act and revoke the proposed Anti-Terrorism Act, ensuring that all anti-terror legislation adheres to international standards. To establish independent mechanisms with prosecutorial powers to hold the police, armed forces and government departments to account for human rights abuses. To incorporate Black July and other root causes of the ethnic conflict into its public education system, and to work with the Tamil community and with international experts to find a real political solution to the ethnic conflict which is acceptable to Tamils on the island. As a UN member state and an ally of Sri Lanka, I would urge that the UK does more to support these calls for accountability, for justice and for human rights protections, so there may be lasting peace and reconciliation. Exact numbers are unclear, but more than 100,000 people, including 40,000 civilians, according to a United Nations panel, may have been killed during the conflict. Ultimately, there must be a right to self-determination for the Tamils. Everyone should be able to live without fear, according to their customs and traditions. There is much that could be done, and I look forward to hearing the Minister's response to this debate. I hope that it will consider officially recognising the atrocities committed as genocide, and will look at introducing sanctions against the known perpetrators, whom to date have escaped being held to account and has denied justice to the victims. Canada and the US have already sanctioned some war criminals. It's high time that the UK was doing the same. Yes, certainly.
Very grateful for the Honourable Gentleman giving way. He's very right at the point to suggest that the UK government should copy what Canada and the United States have done. Does he share my concern that we need greater openness and transparency about the role of the current Foreign Secretary before his appointment, when he was known to be lobbying for the port city in Colombo and has done a lot of work with China and Sri Lanka? Does he agree with me that we need a lot more openness to know that the British Foreign Office is taking this issue seriously and listening to Parliament and to British Tamils?
I thank the honourable member for that, and I would agree entirely. I'm grateful for him making that point, which fits in nicely to some of the comments I have on some of the other aspects. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights recommended that states, including the UK, sanction key human rights perpetrators such as General Silva and other alleged perpetrators in Sri Lanka. By sanctioning individuals responsible for perpetrating crimes against the Tamils, the UK government would support UN and US action in demonstrating that alleged perpetrators of mass atrocities are not welcome here in the UK. Recently, the PM's trade envoy went to Sri Lanka. Encouraging trade without demanding human rights gives the wrong signal to the world, in my opinion. We should be using our influence more effectively. Now, I hope that the September 2024 will see the UN Human Rights Council resolution, which is due to expire, replaced with a new and stronger resolution. Would the Minister agree with me that this should include referring the issue to the UN General Council with the object of achieving a mechanism to bring perpetrators to justice and achieve a permanent political solution going forward? If we are serious about safeguarding the Tamils in Sri Lanka, the legacy of disenfranchisement, deportation and discrimination must be replaced by the principles of peace and democracy. Thank you.
Okay.
Rights. Dame Maria Miller.
Thank you, Sir Edward, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I congratulate the honourable member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for securing this debate today. And I very much welcome the opportunity to contribute, particularly looking at the importance of human rights in Sri Lanka and speaking up for my constituents that still have close links to the Sri Lankan Tamil community. Because wherever we are in the world, Sir Edward, belonging to whatever religion or race, all people deserve to live in peace and safety without discrimination or violence. And this isn't the case for so many Tamils who still live in Sri Lanka. Quite rightly, Sri Lanka is one of the UK's 32 human rights priority countries as identified by the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. And in that department's annual report on human rights and democracy, it has been said that minority communities face continued marginalisation by state authorities, state-supported land appropriation, so-called land grabs sparked concerns over their impact on particularly those communities in the north and the east, and impact on freedom of religious belief, freedom of belief of non-Buddhist denominations. So there is a great deal of understanding in the FCDO about the situation on the ground, and that, coupled with concerns around security forces continuing to disrupt Tamil commemorative events for victims of Sri Lanka's armed conflict and arbitrarily accusing Tamils of links to terrorist organisations. This indicates to me, Sir Edward, that the government is very aware of what is going on the ground in Sri Lanka, and particularly the remarks around the challenges faced by activists and families of those who of the disappeared in the northeast. and those that have faced surveillance, harassment and intimidation by the security forces. So it would appear to me that there is a great understanding here, and this debate today gives my right honourable friend, the Minister, my fellow Hampshire MP, the opportunity to perhaps update the House on the sort of actions that are being taken to take these, this understanding and to turn it into some support on the ground. We've heard, Sir Edward, reports of Tamils living in Sri Lanka being subject to discrimination and threats of violence, as well as being subject to the arrests under the Prevention of Terrorism Act on relatively weak grounds. We also know that Tamils have, on occasions, not been allowed to attend memorials for those killed or lost during the Civil War, which is a vital part of community healing. And back in 2011, we heard from the UK panel of experts that there were credible allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And the fact that these have not been fully investigated or charged or prosecuted has, I believe, diminished the ability of the country to reconcile from the events of the past. Whenever these sorts of events occur, it's so important that well thought through reconciliation is put in place, and particularly when it comes to looking at the situation in Sri Lanka. It's so important for stability and peace in Sri Lanka that there is reconciliation of the actions of the past and that appropriate justice is delivered where it's required. And above all, that the discrimination that we've seen ends. The National Unity and Reconciliation Commission that was established earlier this year felt like a step in the right direction, but many organisations, including Amnesty International, have expressed significant concern that this would not be sufficient. In Sri Lanka, we need to make sure that the Commission does what it needs to do with real reconciliation that has a genuine chance of starting the healing across communities that will bring the whole country together. The first step must be to end all discrimination against Tamils in Sri Lanka. They deserve to be able to live out their own culture and religious practices in peace without interference from other groups. The government and my right honourable friend, the Minister, continues, I know, to work hard to keep very strong relationships with Sri Lanka, which is important for the future of all the communities there and important for promoting peace and human rights. They are clearly putting plans in place. In 2022 to 2025, the Conflict Stability and Security Fund for Sri Lanka from the FCDO supports human rights priorities with more than £11 million. And UK funding for the United Nations Development Programme has also supported the resettlement of displaced communities of land cleared of mines. So it's important that we continue to work with countries like Sri Lanka, and I'm aware that the government is consistently reviewing its global sanctions list, so I'm sure the Minister will want to take the opportunity presented today to perhaps update the House on what the approach is to sanctions, and I'm sure my constituents and people back in Sri Lanka will also be taking note of the comments that he makes. I'm sure my right honourable friend will be listening carefully to the views of members in this debate because equality and freedom from discrimination is not only important to the people in this room but to every single member of this House of Commons. And wherever people live in the world, they deserve to have support from the United Kingdom in their bid to make sure that they live free and equal lives. The UK must, above all else, champion human rights and promote peace across the world, which I hope we will continue to do in Sri Lanka, so that one day all communities there will be able to live in peace and prosperity. Thank you.
John MacDonald.
Thank you, Sir Edward. I want to congratulate the honourable gentleman, not just for securing the debate, but setting the scene so well. I just want to say briefly, I just want to ask the question, how many more times do we have to be here and debate this issue before the UK plays its full role in securing justice for the Tamil community? There's other members in this chamber who, like me, have been around a long while in this issue. I can remember before 2009, but also I do remember 2009 distinctly. There's already, the calculation is over 70,000 at least were unaccounted for. Some of them disappeared. One of my constituents went back to Sri Lanka to try and find his family, and he was disappeared as well. We've never heard from him since. I've received the briefing from the Sri Lankan government, as others have as well, and I've tried to examine that briefing in relation to what I believe is the reality on the ground. There are claims from the Sri Lankan government that a process of reconciliation is taking place and that arrangements have been put in place that will ensure the protection of human rights and civil liberties. That's certainly not the reports that we get from our constituents who have families back in Sri Lanka. And the examples, just very briefly, the recent ones we've been told is Tamil Remembrance Day, in which people were arrested, detained, and then memorials were smashed as well. That doesn't sound like the protection of civil liberties or respect to be meted out to the Tamil community. The use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act has been a continuous abuse, to be frank, and the recent death of, I hope I've got the pronunciation right, the young man Nakarasa Alex, who was detained and died in custody, is another example that the use of detention in this way has resulted, and we know in some instances of torture claims that have taken place.
I thank my friend for giving way on this point and the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. I went to Sri Lanka on a delegation in 1984 and raised with the then President Jayawardena the human rights system, the abuse of human rights and the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And I've met many Sri Lankan families who have people missing from that period on. And unless they get closure and an understanding what's happened to them, the horror for individual families will just go on and on. And I'm sure my friend who represents many Tamil people would endorse the need for us to get an open book on everything that's happened to every person that disappeared.
My honourable friend evidences the long history of this, but the long history of the use of the PTA to detain, the use of the PTA of example after example of torture, but also deaths in custody as well. And from what we hear, the new legislation that's being proposed actually might be worse than the PTA itself. That's the problem that we have. Can I also say the issue that comes up time and time again within the Tamil community in my constituency is the continued militarisation of their Tamil lands and the way in which that land is being used. And I think we have to recognise the operation of the military within Sri Lanka. The military aren't just a military establishment. They're a whole industry in themselves and profiteering at the expense often of the Tamil community, and in particular at the expense of the seizure of the Tamil lands themselves. And the process of demilitarisation has hardly been evidenced by the Sri Lankan government. But I just want to say that actually, why is this happening? Why is the Sri Lankan government continuing to operate with impunity? Well, I actually do think it's a collective failure by the international community, and that includes the United Kingdom as well. We haven't done enough to pressurise the Sri Lankan government. So we have not taken the action I thought we were going to take with regard to the targeting of those identified abusing human rights and effectively war criminals as well, in a way that we've done with other countries. So the use of the Magnitsky Clause, I don't believe from what I've seen or from the evidence we've had, there hasn't been a single use of Magnitsky to sanction the human rights abusers from Sri Lanka. And let's congratulate the USA and Canada who have. We should be following their example. With regard to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that's been established anew, I think this is the 15th, is it, or 16th that's taken place. What we were pressing for before was this should be an independent, international convened commission, not one that's just in-house, almost the country market its own homework. And finally, we did raise the issue before about the reference to the International Criminal Court, because it's quite clear during that period, certainly in 2009, there were offences against the Rome Statute that could be constituted as war crimes. I believe that what we should do now is maximise the pressure that we can put on the Sri Lankan government. We should now look at the use of sanctions. We should look at the review of all the bilateral relationships that we have with Sri Lanka. And in particular, we've raised this before. I don't believe we should have given Sri Lanka the benefit of the country's trading scheme status and the concessions that they have. This is the only way, I believe, that will be influence the Sri Lankan government to abide by some, at least the commitments that they've given us with regard to the protection of human rights and civil liberties and respect for the rights of the Tamil community overall.
Limit their remarks to 5 to 6 minutes, please. Elliot Coleman.
Member for Lytton and Go and East Falkirk for bringing this debate forward, and it's great to see so many members of the APPG for Tamils, which I'm proud to be the chair of, here participating in today's debate. I also received the Sri Lankan ambassador's briefing in advance of this debate, along with an invitation to meet, but given that his predecessor frequently referred to myself and members of the APPG as white tigers, I think I'll be washing my hair that day. The case, I think, has already been compellingly put by colleagues that have already spoken, but just to reiterate some of the harrowing facts. In 2009, for example, tens of thousands of Tamils perished in the Mullawaikal genocide, with many still unaccounted for. And the Sri Lankan government's continued denial of war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide does necessitate the need for international intervention. We've already heard from other members about militarisation, arbitrary arrests under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, rising anti-Tamil nationalism, and the absence of long-term solutions. And in recent months, even in the years that have preceded 2009, all of the promises that have been made by the Sri Lankan government, all the promises that were made under UN human rights resolutions have failed to come to anything. And militarisation is one of those areas where I think that the UK could go further, because militarisation does remain pervasive. 16 out of the 20 military divisions in the island are in the north and the east, otherwise known as in Tamil areas. And demilitarisation is crucial to securing and fostering a sustainable and lasting peace. And to do that, I know that the referral to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout after Sri Lanka's economy crashed could not be linked to human rights. But what it can do is put certain conditions on government spending. And one of the things I think we should absolutely be pushing for is to the reduction in military spending as a result of the IMF bailout. That must be a condition of that money. But there has also been calls for a consistent long-term solution. And I would like to ask the Minister for an update on the mechanism that was secured at the last UN Human Rights Council, 30.1, which for the first time allowed the international community to collect new information. It was a resolution that I know the UK pushed for very hard, and I do want to welcome the efforts that the FCDO put into securing that resolution. But as we've heard, it is up next year, and could I please get an update from the Minister on what he anticipates the UK may be in a position to do when we've had an opportunity to review that new information, to take further action and go forward?
I'll
gladly give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Now, a number of councillors, Councillor Paramnanda, Councillor Jay Ganesh, Nick Rogers and London Assembly, have pushed local authorities to celebrate Tamil Heritage Month, which is next month, and that allows children to celebrate speaking Tamil, the oldest language still in use, and sing songs, Tamil songs, dances, poetry, etc. But part of their heritage is this awful chapter. My honourable friend talked about these resolutions, as did the honourable member who opened the debate. And does he agree with me that rather than waiting for a third resolution, the first of which was backed by Sri Lanka itself, we can actually get some action done rather than having to keep renewing with no action?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend and my predecessor as chair of the APPG on Tamils for that intervention, and he's absolutely right. And I think just in closing, I think the last action that I think the government must urgently look at and review is the issue of sanctions, especially sanctions against those who are credibly accused of war crimes, particularly General Silva, but not just General Silva, many others as well. It's been said already that we are lagging behind the US and Canada, who have already implemented these sorts of sanctions, and I think it is time that the UK follows suit and implements them without any further delay. And as we approach the 15th anniversary of the end of the war, I do hope that the Minister can give us some reassurances that the UK will continue to stand in solidarity with the Tamil community in demanding justice and accountability. The diplomatic efforts and the internal efforts in Sri Lanka have not brought about meaningful change or any lasting peace, and the Tamil community's quest for justice and peace must not be deterred. So it's time for us to follow the international community, impose those sanctions and continue to lead the way in standing up for the rights of Tamil people.
Maybe.
Thank you. Can I contribute to the member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for securing this debate? I join other honourable members in raising the plight of Tamil people over many, many years. Like others, I've been involved in these debates in this House all too frequently. I've tracked this in some detail over the last 26 years as my constituents in Kingston, Surbiton, indeed round South West London, who are British Tamils, have come to me with their concerns with what's happening to their families and their communities. And it's been a very painful episode and continues to be, frankly, even worse than I can ever remember it. The economic crisis in Sri Lanka, with the corruption of the government there, has just made things even worse for both the Sinhalese and Tamil and Muslim communities in that island. But the Tamil people, particularly in the northeast, are suffering under the militarisation, under the land grabs, under the arbitrary detention and arrest, a whole series of injustices and human rights abuses which this House is right to focus on.
Will the right honourable member give way?
I have to give way.
I'm grateful to the right honourable member for giving way. And he mentions an important point that I think we do need to highlight there, which is that it isn't just the Tamil community, but indeed many minority groups on the island are facing human rights abuses. He mentions the Muslim community, and during the pandemic, the Muslim community was subject to forced cremations on the island. So I just wanted through that intervention make sure that we are making it fully aware to the government benches that it isn't just the Tamil community, it's in fact many minority groups that are suffering as a result of the regime.
I think that's right, and that exposes the regime in all its frankly, undemocratic and outrageous behaviour. I want to join other colleagues by saying the UK government can do more than it's done. It can follow the US and China in sanctioning individuals. People have mentioned, quite rightly, General Silva, but there's also General Jayasuriya and others who were involved in those last few months of the war in 2009 who quite clearly committed war crimes. And it's beyond that. I would like to see the government, as others honourable members said, have used the IMF process to try to exert some leverage, use the work at the UN Human Rights Council to exercise more leverage. I think the trade deals is something we could use. When I was Trade Minister, I urged on the EU, as we were then in the European Union, not to give back what were called GSP plus concessions, and we won that argument in the Trade Council in Brussels, and those concessions were not given back to Sri Lanka. Regrettably, they were given back in 2016, and now, after Brexit, Sri Lanka benefits from trade and tariff concessions given by this government. I don't see why they should, and I think we ought to be demanding the repeal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, security sector reforms, and the proper accountability before the Colombo government gets these benefits. But there was one particular issue I wanted to bring to this debate, Sir Edward, because it's not discussed enough in this context, and that's the role of China. The geopolitics of Sri Lanka need to be looked at with the growing role of China and, of course, the influence of India. And I think the UK, the European Union, North America and elsewhere have been remiss in engaging in this debate from that geopolitical stance. And we see what's happened because of the vacuum that's been left. We've seen China invest over the last almost 2 decades in the harbour called Hambantota in the south of the island. And that's, yes, it's got trade advantages for China, and there are many other countries who use that port, but there is no doubt it's a significant strategic investment by China, not just for trade purposes, but potentially for military purposes, given the significance of that port controlling the sea lanes and shipping routes to the south. and China has a 99-year lease on that port. And it's actually indebted the Sri Lankan government, and we're seeing what's sometimes called a debt trap diplomacy, where China is, through the debt and influence it has on the Sri Lankan economy and Sri Lankan politics, is using that more and more. And we're now seeing it with the second big port development. It's actually bigger than a port, it's a city. It's called Port City Colombo, Sir Edward, on hundreds of acres of land that have been reclaimed from the sea in Colombo. And again, China is taking a long-term lease on that, and is essentially a Chinese-owned, government-owned company is developing that. And one surely should be asking about the ability of the UK, the EU, North America, our Indian allies, to try to respond to this. I think this is quite a serious geopolitical development. The Tamil people, who are the subject of this debate, their human rights are disregarded by the Chinese who are interfering in Sri Lankan politics. But if we are going to support those Tamil people and support what I would say all people on the island Sri Lanka, we've got to ask some hard questions about how we respond to this hard power and soft power being exercised by the Chinese government. We've been too naive for far too long, and if we're serious about wanting to influence what's happening on the island of Sri Lanka, we've got to get serious about our diplomacy in New Delhi and in Beijing. And I would ask the Minister, in replying to this debate, if he can say a little bit about the government's thinking in this area, and whether he and I would urge the Foreign Secretary prepared to meet cross-party MPs to discuss this, because I realise some of this may be very sensitive. And in my intervention to the mover of this debate, I mentioned the Foreign Secretary's previous activities prior to his appointment. Now, I'm sure he acted with integrity, but the Minister must realise that people outside this debate, listening in, the British Tamil community and the diaspora and Tamils in Sri Lanka want to know what the British Foreign Secretary is going to think and say and do about the situation in Sri Lanka, whether it's with respect to India or China or the Colombo government themselves. Given that, in January this year, he was visiting Port City Colombo, trying to get investment, supporting the Chinese investment there. I think it's a legitimate question for this House to ask. And I'm sure there are answers. And I'm sure we can be transparent about those. But if we are going to play a role, as the UK, this Parliament's going to play its role influencing the government, we need to understand that because of the centrality of China to the future of Sri Lanka, and indeed, I would argue, to improving the justice for the Tamil people and the human rights for the Tamil people. Thank you, Sir Edward.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Sir Edward Lee. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate, and I congratulate the member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for securing this important debate. In Lewisham East, I represent a significant number of residents from the Tamil community. And since being an MP, I've written to foreign secretaries, and I've attended several events all relating to human rights abuses committed against Tamils. I'm also an officer of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Tamils. Sri Lanka is a beautiful country that one day I hope to visit, but yet it has experienced, as we've already heard, a cycle of violence and since its independence in 1948. As everyone in this debate will know, in 2009, Sri Lankan civil war came to an end when the Tamil Tigers were defeated by the Sri Lankan armed forces. The Sri Lankan government in power at that time denied accusations of crimes made against the military and civilian government. Yet there have been allegations of violence against women and girls, of sexual violence being used as a vicious weapon of war, of rape and the most heinous of crimes, some beyond my imagination, like cutting off women's breasts. It was therefore disappointing that in February 2020, the Sri Lankan government withdrew its support for a UN-led reconciliation process that would investigate and prosecute war-related crimes. Whilst in May 2023, the new government announced that it was establishing a National Unity and Reconciliation Commission. However, organisations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Crisis Group, as well as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights have all questioned whether this will achieve anything and for the victims to receive justice. For a long time now, my constituents have lobbied me over reported human rights abuses in Sri Lanka. The Prevention of Terrorist Act, PTA, has enabled arbitrary arrest, detention without charge or evidence, forced confessions and torture of anyone suspected of terrorism. Whilst there have been amendments to this Act, Amnesty International has stated that Muslims and Tamil minorities remain disproportionately affected by the use of the PTA. This must be addressed and tackled. I'm pleased that my party, the Labour Party, has recommitted itself to securing justice for the survivors, whose families suffered such grave human rights violations. The UK Government must follow the recommendations of the UN High Commissioner to refer the perpetrators of these atrocities to the International Criminal Court. And while we are waiting for this, the political and economic crisis facing Sri Lankans remain deeply concerning alongside humanitarian needs and the geopolitical challenges in the region. In conclusion, accountability for past and reported current crimes is crucial to achieving political sustainability, as is the justice for the affected Tamil victim survivor community. I look forward to the Minister's response.
Gilbert MacDonald.
Thank you, Sir Edward, and congratulations on having this debate. In Easter 2009, I spent my time out on Parliament Square watching an entire community, the Tamil community in London, aside itself with grief as news of relatives, of friends, of communities being bombed, their hospitals being bombed, of people lying on the beach unable to be removed by members of their family or community because the democratically elected Sri Lankan government was dropping cluster bombs on its own people. At that time, I spent my time taking students, London Tamil students, to see the Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, in order to try and prevent some of them taking some drastic action and committing suicide. In those 13 years, how much has changed? The attitude of always negotiating, always talking, always being calm, doing nothing, negotiating. Negotiating what for? Those hundreds of thousands of people have still not been found. Not one person committing a war crime has been prosecuted. There are no more answers than there were before. Now has come the time for the Foreign Office to decide whether it's still going to carry on with the mealy-mouthed diplomacy it has always sought, or actually take action. Use some of the laws that Parliament has given them to take action against those who have perpetrated war crimes. Our Foreign Secretary needs to seriously come forward and be honest about his role in trying to promote the Chinese government's plan for a new port in Colombo. It does not bode well. Let us show Sri Lankans and Tamils differently. Let's take a different path and actually get some movement on progress.
I'm Terry.
It's an honour to serve under your chairships, Edward, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for securing this debate. As we've just heard from my Honourable friend for Hayes and Harlington and Honourable friend for Mitcham Morden, there are so many times that people have been in this room, not just over the past few years, but over decades, calling for the same things, and yet the government is continually failing to act. In my constituency, there are hundreds of people from the Tamil community who've written into me just in the last few days, asking me to speak today because they are concerned deeply about their families' futures in northeast Sri Lanka. Many have written to me about this. Last week, thousands of Tamils in Sri Lanka and around the world commemorated their war dead in the Marvian Isle. But once again, Tamils mourning Sri Lanka faced oppression, a violent crackdown from the Sri Lankan state apparatus in their attempts to remember their war dead, as they visited the remains of the Tamil cemeteries that the Sri Lankan government had already bulldozed. As many as 11 Tamils, including a young schoolboy, were arrested by Sri Lankan authorities after Sri Lankan authorities stormed those remembrance events. The UN has always been clear that Tamils have a fundamental right to remember their war dead on November the 27th, and that any attempt to infringe on this is a clear violation of international law. This is yet another reminder of the daily injustices inflicted on the Tamil people of Sri Lanka. It's now nearly 15 years since the end of the armed conflict. Tamils in Sri Lanka are facing an onslaught from their government, increasing reports of land grabs, the destruction of Tamil places of worship, and the illegal construction of Buddhist viharas. Tamils and Muslims on the island face horrific state-led abuses. Among these abuses are continued use, as many colleagues have said today, of the Draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act, the continued use of torture, of sexual violence, and the extrajudicial killings by Sri Lanka's security forces. Efforts to stifle Tamil voices in Sri Lanka have grown increasingly bold, as seen through the arrest of the Tamil MP Silvarasa Kiranjan. He was detained by the police for commemorating the hunger strike unto death taken by Thilipan, who demanded the right of self-autonomy for the Tamil people. The increasingly violent anti-Tamil nationalist rhetoric continues to be popularised by every single Sri Lankan policymaker. It is vile, ethnic nationalist ideology that continues to echo through those corridors of power. It shapes the policies and the government in ways that marginalise further the Tamil people. And let's be clear, Sri Lanka has a military that's almost double the size of the UK's military. Over 75% of that, though, is deployed in the traditional Tamil homelands. And this, of course, perpetuates a climate of intimidation, human rights abuses, and brutalises the nascent Tamil economy. A variety of UN bodies, from Human Rights Watch as well, and other human rights organisations, have called for justice for the victims of the historic and present atrocities inflicted upon the Tamil people. Many of those accused, far from being prosecuted, have been rewarded with lucrative promotions, most notably the appointment of General Shrivendra Silva to the head of the Sri Lankan Armed Forces, a total and utter disgrace. In 2015, through investigation by the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, the strong and corroborated evidence of the 58th Division, led by Silva, had extrajudicially executed surrendering soldiers and shelled marked civilian hospitals. For the healing process to begin for the Tamil people, says Edward, monsters like Silva must face justice and be removed from the positions of power where they can continue to abuse the Tamil people. And around the world, as we've heard today, policymakers need to be forceful in bringing forward the sanctions that would actually make a difference. We've seen increasingly calls for sanctions against Sri Lankan war criminals. In Canada, they recently sanctioned several individuals, including the former presidents Gotabaya and Mahinda Rajapaksa, for their role in the war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide committed against the Tamils in the north and east of Sri Lanka. Canada's parliament also groundbreakingly unanimously recognised Tamil genocide in a landmark motion, the first recognition of its kind anywhere in the world. The United States has also issued sanctions on General Silva, and in a recent letter to Secretary of State Blinken, several congressmen and women from across the aisle urged the State Department to end the diplomatic impunity enjoyed by Sri Lankan perpetrators of human rights abuses. And despite this, the UK is yet to sanction a single alleged Sri Lankan war criminal. In fact, in the past few years, the UK has provided several million in security assistance to Sri Lanka to aid training and capacity building for the Sri Lankan police and security forces. Now, given these troubling reports, Sir Edward, I'd like to hear from the Minister a commitment to publish an assessment of the impact of the financial support and the full overseas security and justice assistance assessment for activities under this programme to reassure this House that the UK is not contributing to serious human rights violations, as I've previously raised in the House on a number of occasions. The UK's failure to sanction the Sri Lankan military and government officials who are credibly accused of war crimes against humanity and genocide is hampering now international efforts for justice and accountability and rightly enraging the Tamil diaspora around the world. Sir Edward, too many lives have been lost in Sri Lanka's ethnic conflict. Britain has a historic role in the root cause of this ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka due to our dark colonial past on the island and our failure to maintain governance structures that allowed different communities to coexist peacefully on the island. So it is in Britain's duty, in my view, to play a huge and important leading role in supporting the Tamil community as they seek a peaceful political solution in Sri Lanka that meets the aspirations of all people on that island, including the Tamil people's aspirations for self-determination.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Sir Edward. It is indeed a pleasure to serve under your chairship. Can I first of all congratulate the Honourable Gentleman for Lithnagow and East Falkirk for securing the debate and for setting the scene so very well, and for by his leading the debate, he's helped us all to participate. The situation of human rights in Sri Lanka is one which has continually drawn my attention during my time as a Member of Parliament. Unfortunately, the human rights violations of the Sri Lankan civil war have yet to be properly addressed by the Sri Lankan government, nor have many perpetrators, indeed any perpetrators, been brought to justice. Some of those perpetrators continue to hold governmental positions, while reform efforts have had little effect. The Tamil population continues to suffer under governmental restrictions and human rights violations, including disappearances and death. These issues, Sir Edward, and many others have been well documented by the United Nations, and clearly there is a need for reform. And I think that's what we're all asking for, and asking for our Minister and our government to be very active. The European Union helped us implement some changes during their talks. However, the amendments to the Prevention of Terrorism Act have done little to improve the human rights situation of the Tamils and other affected parties. I'd like to focus, if I can, my time on the Prevention of Terrorism Act. That others have spoken about it, or the PTA as I refer to it, and its effects on the Tamil minority religious communities. The honourable gentleman who intervened earlier on referred to the minority religious minorities. I'm going to give some examples, if I can, of all the minorities that are suffering as a result. Freedom of religion or belief is a vital component of the human rights landscape throughout the world. FORB and other human rights are integrally intertwined. They're like two fingers rolled over each other. Human rights and persecution of religious belief march hand in hand. Through the oppression of one human right, all others suffer. I'm chair of the APPG and Freedom of Religious Belief, and I want to talk about that if I can. The PTA has been a tool of the Sri Lankan government to wrongfully detain, oppress political, cultural and religious outliers since its inception in 1979. Of course, the country has a right and a duty to protect its citizens against terrorism and violence. It does not, however, Sir Edward, have the right to wrongfully imprison its own citizens without just cause, nor does it allow for any violations of human rights. The environment of fear and oppression which the PTA has helped to form leads to divisive rhetoric, oft-times grouping together minority populations with the Tamil population centred in the north as a common target. This phenomenon is compounded by the fact that many religious populations are represented in the Tamil population at a much higher rate. These sociological aspects of the situation are important to note because they strongly contributed to the political and cultural dynamic of the region. Violence directed against religious groups, such as the Easter Sunday attacks of 2019, are red flag markers of the aspect of the situation. Other religious minorities are targeted. I've had the chance to meet with some human rights campaigners working on the ground in Sri Lanka who have described the situation of minority religious groups, including the Hindus, the Christians and the Muslims, as one of fear and bureaucratic oppression. New laws make the building of religious structures more difficult, which is particularly harmful for members of religious religions, many of whom tend to come from less prosperous socio-economic backgrounds. Local bureaucracy can prove to be a major stumbling block for minority religious communities, many members of which are Tamil. Police, members of nationalist Buddhist groups and others cause difficulties and harass the worshippers, often leading to meeting supervision. COVID-19 protection laws, which required forced cremations of all burials, forced Muslims to violate Islamic religious observance standards, the very key and core of their beliefs. Thankfully, this policy has come to an end, but other measures remain in place for the oppression of Muslim community members. Per the United States Centre for Religious Freedom's 2022 report on Sri Lanka, Hindu and Muslim sites in the predominantly Tamil Northern Province have been destroyed under the oversight of government agencies, creating space for the building of Buddhist temples. The report notes that this practice was one of the biggest impediments to religious freedom in the Northern Province. So what can the UK government do? What can our minister do? What can our government do? We've seen that bilateral talks can be effective in promoting change, but only to a limited extent. Excuse me. Sri Lanka's economic dependence on the European market was a key point to its PTA reform process. Perhaps that pressure could be put on again. However, these reforms are not adequate to protect human rights in the country. A new strategy is needed, combining bilateral and multilateral efforts. The same is true in international organisations such as the UN. The UK is a leader in human rights advocacy worldwide. Let us use this position to take a stand for the rights of our brothers and our sisters in Sri Lanka, who we all are speaking for here today. When international pressure is applied, Sir Edward, states take note. I have seen this happen throughout the world, and again we ask for our Minister and our government to do the same. Just to say, in conclusion, it's very important to speak on this topic. Discussions like these are the vital parts of the UK's response to injustice and suffering throughout the world. It is encouraging to see debates like this. This week and next, we note the 75th anniversaries of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. It's very clear to me, Sir Edward, that genocide has taken place against the Tamil population, ethnic minorities, religious groups, to such an extent that many of the people, and indeed the Honourable Jennifer Hayes in Harrington referred to some people from his constituency who went to look for some of their constituents or their family members and couldn't find them. There is injustice to be addressed. So I'd hope that these commemorations inspire an increased effort to promoting human rights domestically and throughout the world. I look very much forward to what the Minister will say, and also to the two shadow ministers who I know will encapsulate all the things that we wish to see. And what we really want to see is justice. And that's, at this moment in time, we don't see that.
Anne McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I congratulate my friend, the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk, and I thank him on behalf of all my Tamil friends and colleagues for bringing this debate back here. It really does matter a lot to people, and I think he knows that. It would be easy to say Sri Lanka has been debated and to move on, so I'm really pleased that this place is clearly going to be talking about this until something changes. And I also pay tribute to all the familiar faces in here today. I know their consistent commitment makes a big difference to people. Mr Chairman, I want to start by saying that it is a crime against humanity itself that nobody has been found accountable since this war ended years ago. There has been a sleight of hand performance between then and now, with different Sri Lankan governments promising the international community and their own people that they'll do X, Y and Z, then drawing back, then promising again. But at the end of the day, progress is never made, accountability never happens, reconciliation is never credibly attempted, and peace never really comes to this beautiful island. Mr Chair, I've just repeated the words I used in a speech on this issue in March 2021. I wasn't being lazy. I just wanted to do that to show that it's incredible that I can do that, because 2.5 years on, the situation remains almost exactly the same. But perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, because the Civil War did start 40 years ago, and as the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and Falkirk, he's told us the issues that led to the war date back some many more years. So in the scheme of things, the last 2.5 years since I last stood and spoke in a debate here about this is minuscule compared to the length of time Tamil people have been waiting for justice. That day, Mr Chair, I went on to talk about my time in Sri Lanka, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time doing that now, because it is an incredible island, and it's an island that never seems to get a break. From the 30-year civil war that we're talking about today, to the tsunami of 2004 that saw the deaths of an estimated 227,898 people, the flooding in 2017 that saw hundreds dead and thousands displaced, and the Easter Sunday attack in 2019 that others have spoken of. The people of Sri Lanka, as I say, never seem to get a break, and yet they just get on with it. Whether they're Tamil or Sinhala, there is a fortitude in the people of Sri Lanka that they accept the situation and make what they can of it. Best not to look back, one woman told me as we chatted about her new life in the US, years after her entire family were wiped out by that tsunami. I admired her greatly, and everyone must do what feels right for them, but I can't say I agreed with her philosophy. It's healthy to look back. It's necessary to look back, as long as there's a purpose to that. In the case of what we're talking about today, there is most definitely a purpose. Accountability and truth is essential to reconciliation. So I spent a very short 3 months in Sri Lanka during the Civil War. It was 2008, and I was part of the Scottish Government-funded post-tsunami economic redevelopment programme. I've returned on a number of occasions, and I'm in touch today with Sinhala and Tamil friends in Sri Lanka, and here. In addition to that, I was elected to the Scottish Parliament in 2009, and because I had talked about being in Sri Lanka, many Tamil constituents got in touch with me about being unable to contact their families trapped in IDP camps. It was round about then that I realised how powerless many of us are, even when we are elected, when powerful people are determined to have their way. I stood at one point, believe it or not, at a buffet table of all things with the then President Mahinda Rajapaksa at his home, and I told him I was a member of the Scottish Parliament, and I asked him if he could please help me to find my constituents' loved ones in his IDP camps. I was dismissed and swept away by his people, and off he went to look for those who were happy to make small talk. I spent time in Trincomalee with a man so afraid of what might happen to me should I be caught reading his book about human rights abuses meted out to Tamils, that he removed the cover and replaced it with another to keep me safe. My constituents who'd sought asylum here told me more about those IDP camps, the missing people, those taken hostage. They were arrested but never tried, so in my book, they are hostages. The torture, the sexual violence, enforced disappearances, the shelling of the so-called no-fire zones. And we saw all this very well documented by the Channel 4 two-part documentary, Sri Lanka's Killing Fields, in 2011. The Tamil people cannot be expected to simply move on from that, particularly as we still don't know where all of those who went missing are. And I note what my honourable friend said about the numbers who've been found, according to the High Commissioner. 16 people have been traced alive and 3 dead. That's 19 people of the 18,000, as he said. So all these years later, we just have to find the 17,981 who are still missing. These are shocking statistics, but each of those numbers is a human being, part of a family, being desperately looked for by their loved ones, including the organisation called Mothers of the Disappeared. And they can't just move on. They can't just move on because, as we've also heard today, the worsening economic crisis in the country is leading to worsening human rights abuses. And they do not have to look back to injustices because they're still not getting justice today. Now, I acknowledge that all of this is the fault of the Sri Lankan government, although I acknowledge what has been said as well, and I agree with what's been said about our takeover of Sri Lanka. But the UK government, and I acknowledge that they've also played a vital role as leaders of the core group on Sri Lanka within the Human Rights Council. But I've stood here. We can't just pick and choose where we use our influence when it comes to human rights abuses. I've stood here in this place listening to Foreign Office ministers telling us, don't worry, it's all going to be okay. And I'm sure this is what's going to be told to us today. They will use their influence, etc., on the one hand. And on the other, telling us, as they did in a Westminster Hall debate here in 2015, that it was good news that Sirisena had become president because he wasn't Rajapaksa. But Sirisena had been part of the government when the Tamils were being ruthlessly bombarded, and he subsequently made said Rajapaksa Prime Minister before handing over the presidency to the other Rajapaksa. The Rajapaksa brothers are credibly accused of a host of war crimes during the war and of violating international humanitarian and human rights laws. So you could say the UK government has been too trusting, or you could say that they're doing nowhere near enough to use that influence to safeguard the rights of Tamil people in Sri Lanka. A couple of years ago, the then president pardoned a soldier, one of the few ever to be tried, never mind found guilty. This soldier was guilty of the killing of 8 Tamil civilians, including a 5-year-old child and 2 teenagers. I can only assume this was all part of his promise at the time to end what he called the era of betraying war heroes. Disgraceful. As the SNP spokesperson, I support calls from my honourable friend and other speakers, and I'm interested to hear answers from the Minister on the following. Will he refer the issue to the UN General Council with the objective of achieving an international criminal court or other mechanism to bring perpetrators to justice? In terms of trade, does he agree that Sri Lanka should be removed from the enhanced framework until it meets the conditions already agreed to replace the Prevention of Terror Act with one that meets international standards, which is not what's happening? Will the Minister finally establish a screening policy for diplomatic meetings so that the UK is no longer giving legitimacy to individuals credibly accused of war crimes? And finally, Mr Chair, as just about everyone has asked, will he engage the global human rights sanctions regulations to apply sanctions against individuals credibly accused of involvement in mass atrocity crimes and human rights violations, as the US and Canada have done? It is, the very least, the victims of this war, both living and dead, both here and there, the very least that they can expect from us.
From the member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk, and those with extensive parliamentary experience, such as the member for Hayes and Harlington and Islington North, and of course the well-known and very active all-party group, which works across different groupings and parties, including the outstanding contribution from the member for Mitcham and Morden, who has done that casework day in, day out since 2009 in particular. I also want to put on record the work, the points that have been raised by the member for Ilford South and also for Lewisham, particularly as regards the humanitarian situation which is ongoing in the north of Sri Lanka, and also highlighted by the member for Putney, who talked about water quality, which of course is a very pressing concern for today. And we know, as friends of Sri Lankans and for the many diaspora who are in our communities and come to our advice surgeries with concerns about ongoing lack of consideration of what happened during that terrible period, that indeed, until this is really fully looked at and considered, there will be no peace. So my question really is to the Minister on the wide-ranging relationship which, of course, we have with Sri Lanka as a country. First of all, of course, putting on record the importance of the economic work done in the last 12 months since the sovereign debt crisis, the important work which the High Commission for Sri Lanka worked on with members from across the House to call for economic help for Sri Lanka in the last 12 months, but also that concern that we all have to marry that up with a socially just solution for those who feel that the true horrors of the civil war have not fully been heard. So I wonder, in that context of both the economic imperatives and also the social justice concerns, whether the Minister might say in his concluding remarks what his view is around the role of the current Foreign Secretary, in particular his support for the port project in Sri Lanka, which of course he had a financial interest in, and what he feels as the Minister representing the government now to be the relationship between a state-owned enterprise and the Communist Party and the current Foreign Secretary. Because I think the House does need to know whether the current Foreign Secretary had a financial relationship with a state-owned enterprise, which is basically a development company, or whether he thinks that was an acceptable relationship, and could he please enlighten the House? We also know, of course, that there are a number of important questions that need to be answered from the past, and whilst we warmly welcome a new announcement in May of this year that the Sri Lankan government will be undertaking a National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, we are also listening to NGOs which say that, such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, which was mentioned earlier in the debate, that there is a lack of genuine confidence in the milestones that need to be achieved towards the confidence that we can all have internationally in that commission. So I wonder whether the Minister might say to the House today whether he feels that this commission has achieved the milestones which would be expected between May and December of this year, so that we can all have confidence, and we can give confidence to our constituents when they come and see us in our advice surgeries, and we can reassure them that the UK is playing its part to hold the government to account in Sri Lanka, and to have a similar sort of process, such as what happened in South Africa,
around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there, which was actually held up to be a real gold standard of this sort of work. And I'll be very interested in hearing what the Minister's assessment of where we are at with that, given that now 8 months have gone by, and have we seen the sort of work that is needed in order to lead to the sort of outcome that we saw in South Africa. Of course, the UN panel of experts has expressed a desire to see credible evidence of the war crimes, and also to see that justice is served. And in particular, during this debate, we've heard a number of members underlining the role which General Da Silva played during the conflict. And I wonder whether the Minister has made an assessment on whether the Magnitsky sanctions framework, which is post-Brexit one of our most important tools for holding to account the actions of certain individuals, whether he feels that this would fit into a potential Magnitsky sanction framework. Now, we're all aware that the standard response from a minister when asked this question is that we don't comment on these because that would then, spoil the process of sanctions, because they're meant to be done sort of almost by surprise. But I wonder whether the minister could hint to us in this House, as we're so concerned about this particular issue, what his particular view of that individual is, as his name does come up in so many of these representations at the UN panel of experts. I'm coming to an end, Sir Edward. I also wanted to ask whether he feels that there is a case to be answered based on his assessment of the evidence at the International Criminal Court, or whether he thinks that there is going to be, it will be suffice to have the process of the national reconciliation. Does he feel that there will be another step after that, which will go into the ICC? And finally, what measures are being taken to support Sri Lanka's pathway to become the pluralistic, multicultural democracy where all of its people can flourish? Recently, I had a wonderful briefing from a fantastic UK organisation called Halo Trust, which I know that the Minister and others in this place will know of their great work. And their work is coming to an end after a decade of sorting out landmines in the north of Sri Lanka. And I just hope that with the ending of that particular chapter and the opening of a new one where truth and reconciliation can be key, and where all of the diaspora and individuals who were so whose lives were destroyed by that dreadful civil war, is the Minister confident, or can he tell us what his concerns are, so that our Sri Lankan diaspora and those who care deeply about human rights in our constituencies can have the confidence that the UK government is doing its part to uphold peace and democracy? Thank you.
Minister. Well, thank you very much indeed, Sir Edward. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for securing this important debate. Of course, the Minister of State for the Indo-Pacific, the Right Honourable Member for Berwick-upon-Tweed, would normally be answering this debate, but she is, however, on a plane on her way to Australia, and it's therefore my pleasure to be here in her place. And I am grateful for all of the powerful and moving contributions from Honourable and Right Honourable members, and I'll try to cover off the points raised and set out the government's position. And of course, the UK government pays close attention to the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, especially for the many Tamils, the perils of which have been movingly and powerfully described today by all members. And I note particularly the interests of the all-party parliamentary group, and including the chair and other members, and I'm grateful for their contributions. Of course, Sri Lanka is one of 32 FCDO human rights priority countries. This is in recognition of our ongoing human rights concerns in a number of areas, including the rights of people from minority groups. As honourable members will know, and as described this afternoon, the continuing marginalisation and repression of Tamil communities follows many years of racial and religious tensions in the country, culminating in the Civil War, as described in very clear terms this afternoon. And it's important to recognise that a number of different communities, including Tamils, who predominantly reside in the north and east of the country, face this marginalisation, continue to face marginalisation by state authorities. There have been increasing land seizures and disputes which have sometimes centred around religious sites, such as the Ayanar Hindu temple in Mullaitivu. This clearly has troubling implications for freedom of religion or belief. And more recently, we're very clear that there has been state-sponsored settlement of traditional pasture land in Batikaloa, which threatens the livelihoods of local farmers, something that was referred to this afternoon. There have been several incidents of heavy-handed policing of peaceful protests and commemorations, and there is ongoing surveillance and intimidation by state security forces in the north and east of the country. This particularly focuses on civil society activists and Tamil communities affected by the war, including former combatants and the families of the disappeared. And of course, these events have increased heightened communal tensions, and they continue to stoke perceptions of forced displacement from traditionally Tamil areas. Now, a running theme was the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which was described in stark terms by a number of members. Of course, the UK government remains very concerned about the ongoing use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, despite the Sri Lankan government's long-standing commitment to replace this piece of legislation with an improved with a version that would meet its international obligations. It continues to be used as laid out this afternoon, as most recently as last week, and we continue to call on the government of Sri Lanka to deliver on its promises and live up to its international obligations. So the concerns laid out this afternoon with regard to the PTA legislation we acknowledge. From the government side, promoting human rights, reconciliation and justice and accountability is a key strand of our policy towards Sri Lanka. The Minister of State for the Indo-Pacific visited Sri Lanka in October. When there, she met the President, the Foreign Minister and the Justice Minister. She also met the Governor of the Northern Province, as well as meeting Tamil representatives and civil society activists in Colombo and Jaffna. And she also visited community projects, including a demining project run by the Halo Trust and paid for by British assistance. Yes, delighted to give way.
Thank the Minister for giving way. Minister, it's just a side issue for what you said there. Minister, you mentioned about all that government's doing. Could I gently suggest, Mr. Chairman, that maybe perhaps when it comes to economic ties, whether it be banking, whether it be bigger business or whatever it may be, that the issue of human rights and the persecution of Christians, etc., are an integral part of any discussions that take place, and ensure that when you move forward, that those are conditional to the economic context. Just as a
he makes a good point, and those and the role of the trade envoy was mentioned this afternoon. Well, we're very clear that human rights and trade discussions go alongside. They are not mutually exclusive, and that's a perfectly reasonable suggestion. Whilst the Minister of State for the Indo-Pacific, returning to my commentary on her visit, she raised the needs for progress with the government of Sri Lanka on human rights for all communities in Sri Lanka, and she also raised the need for justice and accountability for violation and abuses committed during and following the armed conflict. And of course, we recognise that also other communities in Sri Lanka, as mentioned this afternoon, including Muslims as well as Tamils, face discrimination, harassment and a lack of justice. Now, in addition to our face-to-face diplomacy, the UK government has an £11 million programme that supports human rights and reconciliation in Sri Lanka. We have specific projects and programmes that help tackle the legacy of the conflict, support civil society and democratic processes, promote gender equality and reduce inter-community tensions. And we've been a leading member of the core group of countries who work to improve human rights, justice and accountability in Sri Lanka, and we will continue to be in that core group. We have worked within the UN human rights system to raise concerns and build international support to strengthen human rights. And we used our statement to the UN Human Rights Council in September to highlight the vital need to respect freedom of religion or belief and freedoms of expression and association in Sri Lanka. And we also press for progress on justice, accountability and reconciliation. The UK delegation led work on the most recent UN Human Rights Council resolution on Sri Lanka, which the chair of the APPG asked about, and we will continue to use that as a tool to argue for progress. Yes, I'm delighted to give way.
I just wanted to get an assurance from him that the British government's relationship with Sri Lanka will ensure there is always unfettered access to UN human rights monitors and inspectors into Sri Lanka, because there have been at times more than reticence, indeed obstruction, towards their inspection, and it is obviously necessary to get an independent view of the situation.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman makes a good point. We continue to argue for unfettered access for those sorts of inspectors, and we will continue to do so. In that resolution, which was asked about by the chair of the APG, whom I could commend for his tremendously active carrying out of that office, in that resolution we focused international attention on the human rights shortcomings, and we succeeded in renewing the mandate of UN human rights experts to report on these issues and preserve evidence of abuses and violations committed during the armed conflict, so that justice can be pursued. And we will continue to use that resolution as a lever to argue for positive change, and I'm grateful for the question from my honourable friend. Now, turning towards some of the small positive steps, because when working with countries to strengthen their human rights, their human rights adherence, it's important to acknowledge any progress that there may be. In that spirit, we welcome steps taken by the Sri Lankan government to address some Tamil grievances, including the release of some disputed lands and the release of long-term detainees. We welcome the government's engagement with Tamil representatives on a long sought-after political settlement, and we have urged the government to consider further confidence-building measures and engagement. We welcome steps taken by the government to improve connectivity between the north and counties between the north and countries in the region, including through regular flights. And we believe this should help increase economic opportunities for the North and others in that region. We also welcome the government's commitment to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we encourage them strongly to consult widely and come forward with detailed proposals. Sir Edward, delighted. Delighted.
I'm sure he genuinely believes the speech that he's making, but the Foreign Office have, in the last 13 years, been beseeching the Sri Lankan government for an independent truth and reconciliation process. To date, it hasn't happened. At what point will he try something else?
Well, these are clearly profoundly difficult issues which will not be solved quickly, but it is our judgment that we must continue with our diplomacy and our strong encouragement for the government of Sri Lanka to come forward with detailed proposals about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As unlikely as it may seem this afternoon, that is the intent of our diplomacy, and we will continue to do that. Now, Sir Edward, we will continue to. I will give way in a moment. We will continue to monitor human rights developments in Sri Lanka closely, including the marginalisation and repression faced by Tamil communities and other minorities. And I'm delighted to give way.
Would he undertake, given the scepticism about yet another announcement of this sort of process, would he therefore give pledge to continue more truthful and thorough approaches, for example, looking at the question which was raised earlier in the debate about the role of the ICC for certain of the terrible events that happened during the Civil War? Is it the assessment of the FCDO that there is a case to answer in the ICC?
Well, the honourable lady will know that the ICC, being independent, will make its own judgments about the prospect of prosecution. But of course, when it comes to the relationship that we have with the Sri Lankan government, candour is at the heart of that, and frank speaking is at the heart of that. And that's why we will continue to make the point about the need for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And of course, delighted.
To be too harsh on the honourable gentleman, particularly as he's standing in, but the honourable member for Glasgow North East used part of her speech from 2021. This sounds distinctly like the same response that we had at that debate, almost word for word. Could you just address one issue for me? Will the government, because this is solely up to the government, will the government now explore the use of the Magnitsky Clause sanctions against known human rights abuses from Sri Lanka?
Well, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for his question. He, of course, will know that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on sanctions from the dispatch box, and no government minister would do that. But, of course, we note the strength of feeling expressed by honourable and right honourable colleagues this afternoon. And, of course, so we are concerned about the ongoing land disputes, the continued harassment and surveillance of civil society, and limitations on freedom of expression, assembly and association. And we will continue to urge the Sri Lankan government to adhere to its human rights obligations and fulfil its commitments on transitional justice, legislative reform, and to take steps to build trust in its institutions. Very pleased to give way.
I understand the point he makes about not commenting on sanctions from the dispatch box. Could I just reiterate and re-urge him to take the strength of feeling from this debate, and for many years now we've been asking for this, to take that back to FCDO. On the point about the ICC, indeed it is independent. There are independent referrals to the ICC that private individuals are taking forward against certain members of Sri Lankan military society at the moment. Whilst the UK government is not engaged in that process, could I ask him to review whether or not the FCDO could, at the UN, encourage that information collection which is being done as part of the recent human rights resolution to be passed on to those who are trying to bring forward that prosecution?
Well, I know the Minister of State for the Indo-Pacific will in due course hear that plea and give it her consideration. I'll wrap up because I want to leave 2 minutes for the conclusion. But I'll conclude by saying, of course, the UK government will remain a leading role on the international stage, working with civil society and through the UN to deliver meaningful human rights improvements for Tamils and all Sri Lankans. And in response to the question posed by the Honourable Lady for Hornsey and Wood Green and the Right Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton, of course, when it comes to the role of the Foreign Secretary, let us be clear that as Prime Minister, Lord Cameron led the way in ensuring that the UK spearheaded international efforts to seek improved human rights, justice and accountability for sanctions. And that is something we should be very clear about. And of course, no one should doubt that our China policy is very clear-sighted. And any mature consideration of the facts will lead one to believe that the Foreign Secretary brings tremendous experience, credibility and integrity to his role. Thank you very much, Robert.
We've had a very consensual debate from right across the House, which I think shows the strength of feeling that crosses normal political divides. It's quite clear that far more needs to be done than has been done to date. And while I'm grateful for the Minister's response, the fact that the UK government is very concerned and will call on Sri Lanka to deliver on its promises just doesn't cut it. We've heard all that before. We really need further action, particularly around the area of sanctions, and also ensuring that there's international scrutiny of the reconciliation process. And I think that is vital for getting any long-term solution. Unlike in South Africa, where a minority were the oppressors of the majority and then power changed, it's a very different dynamic in Sri Lanka, and it clearly needs international scrutiny. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered Sri Lankan Tamils and human rights. As many as our opinions say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The next debate will resume in a couple of minutes. Thank you, Minister. I am the chairman of this august body. Yeah, we start on the dot. It's just somebody may force a division, but as it's only three of us in this debate, we don't need to go, we can carry on with the debate. We are now starting. Order, order. And I call Mrs. Pauline Latham to move the motion.
Thank you. I beg to move that this House has considered powers to search digital devices at the UK border. And it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Edward. We live in a digital age, and the powers our law enforcement agencies have do not mirror this. Our border force is one agency that cannot carry out its duties properly due to the powers it was afforded in an analogue age, which have never been updated. 835,000 individuals in the United Kingdom represent a sexual risk to children. The proliferation of online child sexual abuse and exploitation material means more and more children can become victims to sexual predators. One place where our law enforcement agencies can intervene is at our ports of entry into our country. It's here where previously unknown predators can be identified, stopped, and prevented from harming our children. 85% of online child sexual offenders are also hands-on abusers. And if the Border Force were able to intercept individuals who offend digitally, we can stop children from being abused physically. The Border Force is in a unique position to help tackle this, and I believe government should afford them the statutory power to search passengers' digital devices for child sexual abuse and exploitation material. And I wish to see a new offence of obstruction allowed where individuals refusing to cooperate with any reasonable digital searches are prosecuted. The current scope of the UK's Border Force search powers is designated by the out-of-date Customs and Management Act 1979. These powers grant Border Force the power to search the person and the baggage of an individual entering or leaving the United Kingdom in order to detect the import and export of prohibited goods. And prohibited goods has a very broad definition under the Act and includes child sexual abuse and exploitation materials such as images, videos, and childlike sex dolls. But under the Act, the UK Border Force is not required to have reasonable grounds to suspect that an individual entering or leaving this country possesses prohibited goods in order to utilise them to search them in a port environment. However, the scope of a Border Force search powers granted under the 1979 Act were conceived for a world which knew nothing about the internet, let alone the smartphone. And almost every passenger who passes through a UK port carries a digital device, be it a smartphone, tablet, laptop, or hard drive. Some of these passengers travel with digital child abuse and exploitation materials, images and videos created in the UK or abroad on their devices. Under the provisions of the Customs and Excise Act 1979, Border Force cannot compel a passenger to unlock a digital device, but the police can, not at the Border Force area, but in the country. So if a passenger refuses to unlock their device at the Border Force's request, there's nothing they can do, nothing at all. The passenger is not committing a criminal offence because we do not have a criminal offence of obstruction for this circumstance. But the Border Force must then let the passenger suspected of possessing prohibited goods pass into our country, and there's no grounds to arrest them. And since 85% of digital child sexual offenders become hands-on abusers, we need to stop individuals from having the chance to abuse our children at the first possible opportunity. And our Border Force could be part of that arsenal to stop those offenders at our border. The powers they have do not extend to being able to require a person, as it were, to open their digital baggage for a search to be conducted. Their existing powers are no longer fit for purpose. Back in the 1970s, child sexual abuse material would amount to a stack of Polaroid photographs, which the Border Force could readily detect. They were on paper before the Border Force's very eyes, if they suspected it. Today, these images are now carried digitally, more often than not, are behind locks such as passwords, passcodes and encryption software. And under the existing legislative framework, the Border Force is unable to penetrate these locks without the passenger's consent. And I believe that many children could have been saved from child predators if the Border Force had intercepted them when they had the opportunity. There have been numerous examples of passengers entering or exiting the UK who travel alone and without dependents, identified to have been in possession of paraphernalia associated with the commission of sexual offences against children. If a passenger travels with toys, lubricants, condoms and children's underwear, many of which are key indicators of an abuser, it's highly likely the passenger will be in possession of digital child sexual abuse and exploitation material. With digital search powers, the Border Force could arrest the passenger if he possessed such material. And to counteract situations as described, we need to introduce a new criminal offence of willful obstruction. An individual would be prosecuted for this offence when he refuses to unlock his digital device so it can be searched for obscene or indecent material. This can be done in seconds because the technology already exists and our police do have access to this. We would protect more children by granting the Border Force this power. Individuals entering our country posing a sexual threat to children would be arrested as soon as it was discovered they owned indecent child abuse images on their phones and laptops. Granting the power I've outlined to the Border Force would enable them to become an active part of the cross-agency response to identify previously unknown persons at risk for harming children. Any digital devices seized by the Border Force containing any new sexual abuse and exploitation produced by the passenger that hasn't yet been uploaded to the internet will be prevented from being uploaded to that internet. And critics might say that this proposal is too intrusive, and I have heard that. Then there's a grave potential for an individual's right to a private life to be infringed as set out under Article 8 of the Human Rights Act 1998. Doesn't worry too much about the children that are abused. A standard operating procedure would make such a device, make sure a device was inspected by a scan which looked for file codes associated with known files associated with child abuse files already catalogued and verified by the Home Office. No file will be downloaded by the Border Force and no manual inspection of the device will be needed as the scan is driven by code only. And as such, there's no possibility of collateral intrusion and an individual's digital private life being invaded. It's worth noting that a similar power already exists in the police in relation to terrorist material under Section 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000. And the power I wish to see the Border Force possess already exists within customs legislation across a number of countries globally, notably in New Zealand, a member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Alliance. New Zealand brought in a similar digital search power under then 2018 Customs Act. Their act introduced a step process for examining devices in furtherance of detecting prohibited materials, including child sexual abuse material, at their borders. The New Zealand process is comparable to that which I believe would work for the UK, and the Border Force could carry out a step 1 initial scan indicating the presence or not of indecent material. If indecent material is detected, the UK Police or National Crime Agency would carry out a more intensive step 2 scan. New Zealand have already begun to see success stories on the back of this legislation. And New Zealand's Act also provides a coercive power for their customs force to require access to an electronic device, the breach of which triggers a $5,000 fine and device seizure. And I believe this would be a sensible mechanism for the UK to adopt too. Detection at the border is often the starting point for wider investigation, which encompasses identifying further devices and materials held at the suspect's home address or contact offences against minors. Where this power exists in other countries, it's typically without the requirement for reasonable suspicion. However, the power I'm seeking here will be legally used only when there are reasonable grounds to suspect an individual possesses indecent and obscene material. And we'd avoid any abuse of this power, as a high burden would be placed upon the border force ahead of its use. The UK's current baseline for detecting individuals representing a risk to children at the UK borders is near zero, due to the absence of the ability to verify digital media. They then have to alert the police about their suspicions, which can take a couple of weeks for the police to trace the individual. And there have been cases where the suspected individual has raped 2 or more young girls before the police have caught up with them. If the border force were granted these powers, we would protect children from the lifelong harm of being abused by a sexual predator. Even without immediate prosecutions for possessing child abuse material, the detection of a suspect at the border will enable a management plan to be developed at pace that mitigates risk to minors with immediate effect. If the border force had the same access to these devices that the police have, and they can scan it very rapidly, then pass the suspects on to the police, we would stop that gap and we would stop those children being raped and abused. And I think for the sake of our children in this country, we need to do that. So I hope my friend, the Minister, my honourable friend, the Minister, will agree with me it's time to make our border force able to tackle digital baggage. The border force is well placed to detect individuals who pose a sexual risk to our children. For them to perform their duty to protect us now, we must give them those necessary tools. And the tool to search digital devices is one that, quite frankly, should be given to them today.
Questions that this House has considered powers to search digital devices at the UK border. Minister?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Okay. I congratulate the Honourable Member for Mid Derbyshire for securing this debate, and may I compliment her for her steadfast commitment to the rights of children and protecting them from sexual exploitation in a range of ways. I want to start by making some preliminary observations. First of all, she presents a compelling case, and one that I do undertake to take back to my ministerial colleagues and discuss further. Because the truth is that the opportunity represented by inspecting digital devices at the border to increase our ability to tackle and prevent sexual abuse is one that we should take very seriously, and it is a key priority for this government. I will go through, I think, the scale of child sexual abuse as it currently exists, and I know she's already familiar with this anyway, but the Office for National Statistics estimates that there are perhaps as many as 7.5% of children in this country who will experience some form of child sexual abuse before the age of 16. That's the equivalent of just over 3 million people across England and Wales. Reports from the Internet Watch Foundation show that the fastest growing age group appearing on online child sexual abuse imagery is 7 to 10-year-olds, and the prevalence of the most severe forms has more than doubled since 2010. Not only are the children being abused, but the moments of their lives are being captured, uploaded onto the internet, and essentially frozen in perpetuity. There is, for them, a never-ending cycle of abuse from which they will never escape. And the files are not even hidden in hard-to-reach parts of the internet. Many of them can be accessed within just 3 clicks. The Honourable Member knows how seriously we take child sexual exploitation in this country. First of all, we are the government that implemented the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse with a historic focus, but nonetheless informing the work that is going to, which is continuing. We also recognise the unique vulnerability of children online. We have tackled that, I think, to some extent through the passage of the Online Safety Act, which brings companies in scope under legal duties to proactively combat the threat of child sexual abuse on their platforms and to identify, report and remove material. We're now working with the independent regulator Ofcom and the National Crime Agency to implement and operationalise these new powers and duties. However, I don't want to duck the wider point that she's making, which is basically at the border there can be a very important opportunity to apprehend and arrest perpetrators, and there will on occasions be important probative material which would lend a member of the border force to reasonably suspect that on their device they have got images which would suggest serious criminality and will give an opportunity for interception. As people enter or leave our country, we can see where they're going or where they've been. We can create risk profiles based on their movements, noting when someone may have travelled to multiple locations which are well known for child sex tourism. Under our existing customs powers, the Border Force can, without the requirement for reasonable suspicion, check the baggage of people entering and leaving, which may include obscene or indecent materials, notably child and baby-like dolls, sometimes with purpose-built internal sex organs. Specialist Border Force teams are trained to capture this key information, seize materials and arrest where appropriate. Yes, I will give way.
I recognise what my honourable friend is saying, but there is this gap. And the Border Force need these powers because they can search bags, they can search the pockets, they can strip search the individual. They can't look at their phones or any device. And that's where the gap lies. And if we don't close that gap, we will have even more children being abused on a regular basis.
Thank you. Well, I think the Honourable Lady, my Honourable friend, has made a very good, has accurately pointed out what looks like a lacuna in the law where physical objects that may be identified in the baggage indicate something that the Border Force simply don't have the powers to search. And I've already undertaken to go back to ministers and discuss this with them. I want to reassure her that the government remains firmly committed to exploring and exercising all potential levers to safeguard children and to bring offenders to justice. We will continue to work across the whole system to ensure we're doing all we can to tackle this abhorrent crime. And I thank the Honourable Lady again for securing this important debate.
The question is that this House has considered powers to search digital devices at the UK borders. Many of that opinions say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Sitting suspended now until 4:30. Order, order. Liz Twister, move the motion.
Thank you, Sir Edward, and it's a pleasure to be able to move this resolution. And I beg to move that this House has considered violence and abuse towards the retail workforce. And it's a pleasure to serve under you as Chair, Sir Edward. I applied for this date, Sir Edward, following a visit to a Tesco supermarket in Rowlandsgill in my constituency of Blaydon. I did that quite recently, but of course other brands are available, and I also visited my local co-op more recently to talk to the staff there as well. That visit took place to mark Respect for Shop Workers Week, the yearly campaign led by USDOR in the run-up to the busy Christmas shopping period. The campaign has several aims. First and foremost, it's about making it clear that abuse of shop workers is not part of their job and it's not acceptable. It's about ensuring that employers, police and politicians are aware of the scale of the problem of violence and abuse against our retail workforce and do something about it, frankly. And from an MP's perspective, it's about listening to shop workers, recognising their concerns and looking at what we can do to support them. Now, from my visit, it was obvious to me that we are simply not doing enough. The shop workers I spoke to told me about the growing frequency of theft, which is an issue right across the country. Figures from the British Retail Consortium show that there was a 26% rise in incidents last year. But the shop workers also wanted to emphasise that the kind of incidents taking place has changed. Not only are there more incidents of theft, but they're increasingly violent in nature. Shop workers are feeling intimidated, threatened, and fear going into the workplace, particularly when returning to work after experiencing or witnessing violent behaviour towards them or their colleagues. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate her on achieving this debate, which is so important. I also went to see shop workers in my constituency of Putney with USDOR to the co-op and was also surprised to hear of so many incidents of violent attack and the intimidation that so many people face just going to work. Does my honourable friend agree that it's particularly disheartening that the government continues to resist Labour's plans to make violence against shop workers a specific criminal offence, which would make it much safer for shop workers across my constituency and hers and across the country?
I thank the honourable member for that intervention, and I most certainly do agree with her. And clearly her experiences of visiting shop workers has been the same of mine, and she's heard the same stories. So we must do something to make it an offence. Yeah.
And the Honourable Lady for Blaydon for bringing this forward. It's a massive issue in my constituency. And just as an example, my eldest son used to manage a local shop on the high street of the main town where I reside. He has made me aware on a few occasions where young people have brought in knives and other instruments to steal items from the store, instilling a real severe sense of fright and fear within all staff. A young girl who worked in the shop, 19-year-old, she was scared stiff, and I use those words on purpose. So does the Honourable Lady agree that retail staff often face the most violent torrent of abuse, and that more must be done to protect their security, including two things, whether that be in terms of panic buttons or immediate access to the police, because quite often the police don't attend?
Well, I thank the honourable member for that intervention, and of course he's right to remind us that this isn't only about supermarkets, Sir Edward, it's about small shopkeepers as well, when I think of some of the villages in my constituency. So I just wanted to talk a bit about some of the comments of shop workers from the North East, given in response to USDOR's survey, with thanks to USDOR for sharing them with me. And these are quotations. I've had name-calling, threats of being hit with bottles, needles, and actual assault. Another person said, shoplifters swing crutches, punches, and bags. They've made threats on my life and talked of getting me jumped. Another, there's homophobic insults, intimidating words, and being spoken down to. And another, I've been pushed over, punched in the head, and jostled by a large group. And I'm sure that MPs across this House will agree with me that no one deserves to fall victim to such abuse simply for doing their job. That's true whether you've been working in a shop for 20 days or 20 years. And we should also highlight that retail has a young workforce. More than 1 in 4 retail workers are aged 24 and under, and more than 60% of new starters are in this age bracket. A small but significant proportion are aged just 16 and 17. Retail offers fantastic opportunities for young people to get into employment, and it's shameful that they might be deterred from doing so as a result of the abuse that might be inflicted upon them. Now, many workers also have caring responsibilities that they fit around their shift patterns. It's unconscionable to think that they're experiencing such fear in their daily working lives. I encountered these stories in my own constituency, but the figures suggest that this local picture is representative of national trends. In March 2023, the British Retail Consortium published a report into the scale of violence and abuse towards shop workers. The report found that incidents, including abuse, physical assault and threats with weapons, rose from 450 per day in 2019-20 to around 850 per day in 2021-2022. And they also found that only 7% of incidents of violence or abuse were actually prosecuted. I will.
For giving way. There are incidents of violence towards shop workers, I'm afraid to say, in Harrow town centre, which I'm privileged to represent, and too many incidents of anti-social behaviour in the town centre too. A couple of years ago, Harrow just missed out on securing a dedicated town centre police team allocated by the Metropolitan Police, which other similar town centres across London are benefiting from. Would my honourable friend encourage the Minister to use her influence with the current Metropolitan Police Commissioner to allocate a dedicated town centre police team to Harrow, as other similar-sized town centres across London have?
I thank my honourable friend for that comment, and I hesitate to venture into other police areas, but it is an issue that we find across a number of regions, and certainly that issue of antisocial behaviour is something that I would like to come on to. And dedicated police teams can be very helpful. So I hope that the Minister will listen to that plea. Now, I know that I'm not the first person to bring this issue to the House's attention. In fact, there have been 2 Westminster Hall debates that have considered similar motions just in the last 5 years, one of them from the Petitions Committee. So this is something which clearly our constituents care enough about to sign a public petition which reached over 100,000 signatures. And in 2020, the government produced its response to a Home Office consultation on violence and abuse towards shop staff that began in April 2019. It promised to address the roots of the issue and provide support to victims. And in 2022, an amendment to the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill was enacted, making it the case that where a victim of a range of specified offences had been providing services, goods or facilities to the public at the time of the offence, this would be an aggravating factor for sentencing purposes. And the government have said that they consider the existing law sufficient to protect retail workers. That leads me to pose the question, which retail workers have the government been asking? Because speaking to workers on the ground, it's clear that the protections already in place are insufficient. Despite the debates and despite the consultation, we're still seeing incidents of violence and intimidation rise. USDO's survey of retail staff in 2023 reported that 2/3 of their members working in retail are suffering abuse from customers. 42% had been threatened by a customer and 5% were assaulted. We're talking about being spat at or coughed at, being slapped, punched or kicked and attacked with weapons. Shockingly, the executive chairman of Iceland has revealed that 3 Iceland workers are now HIV positive as a result of needle attacks on staff. And last year, USDO's figures showed that 4 in 10 retail workers experience anxiety about work, and 3 in 10 are considering changing jobs as a result. That's why we're continuing to see them speak up about the conditions that they're working in. The Westminster Hall debate, which took place in 2021, as I said, was prompted by a petition asking the government to enact legislation which would create a specific offence of abusing, threatening or assaulting a retail worker. And as I said, it reached over 100,000 signatures, but still the epidemic of violence continued. So this year we've seen another petition started, still in force, calling for the same measure to be taken. There's a strong, consistent public demand for change. Now, speaking to shop workers in my constituency, and store managers, in fact, they feel strongly that the creation of a specific offence is the right path to follow. They believe that this would not only recognise the scale of the problem, but also that it would encourage attendance by the police, which they feel is lacking, as my honourable friend from Harrow East has said. They believe that this would not only recognise the scale of the problem, but also that it would encourage attendance by the police, which they feel is lacking. There's a widespread feeling within the retail sector that theft has been effectively decriminalised, Sir Edward, over the last 13 years of Conservative government. In this same vein, yeah.
I thank my good friend for giving way. I wonder if she agrees with me on 2 points. Firstly, that this is a very serious matter and impacts every single constituency in the UK. And secondly, there doesn't seem to be a priority on the government benches to tackle violence and abuse against shop workers. Yeah. And we can see that there are, as far as I can see, there are no speakers from government benches in this debate. So I wonder if she agrees with me on both those points.
Well, I certainly agree that government has failed to go far enough in this. It had the opportunity last year when it introduced the aggravation legislation, but actually we need to go much further than that. Yeah. So, as I said, last year, Usda's figures show that 4 in 10 retail workers... Oh, sorry, I've lost my place. Speaking to shop workers and store managers in my constituency, they feel strongly that the creation of a specific offence is the right path to follow. They believe that this would not only recognise the scale of the problem, but also that it would encourage attendance by the police, which they feel is lacking, as I said earlier. There's a widespread feeling within the sector that theft has been effectively decriminalised. In the same vein, another policy being criticised is the practice of issuing fixed penalty notices for shop thefts under £200. The failure to investigate these thefts leaves workers feeling as though crimes that they've experienced, often involving abusive behaviour towards them, is not taken seriously by the police or the government. And this lack of confidence in our institutions has been reflected by a drop in reporting of incidents of violence and abuse. The British Retail Consortium note that there's been a decline in reporting of such incidents to 32%, as workers have increasingly lost faith that the police will take action. Now, the commitments made in the Retail Crime Action Plan, which tell police to prioritise incidents involving violence, are welcome. But we need to ensure that local police forces are encouraged and supported to implement this approach on the ground. And, Sir Edward, we need to make sure that they have the resources to respond. And certainly in my police area, in Northumbria Police, we are still 400 police officers down from 2010. And it's the same in other parts of the North East. Now, while retail workers find themselves at the front line of antisocial behavioural issues, the problem goes beyond shop floors. Across my constituency and across the country, people are concerned about the antisocial behaviour taking place in their own communities. When my submission for this debate was accepted, it sparked a conversation within my office about times that, as customers, we have seen these acts of aggression play out. With the winter months and the dark nights getting ever earlier, this worry of bad behaviour in shops will not just be a fearful situation for the staff, but one that risks turning away customers. Now, strikingly, Usda's most recent survey suggests that an estimated 2/3 of abusive incidents are linked with addiction. And yet we see nothing in the government's announcement of the Pegasus programme that acknowledges this relationship or explores the role that drug and alcohol treatment services have to play in tackling this issue. So this is another area in which the government's promise to address the root causes of retail crime rings completely hollow. Now, it's astonishing that for all of these statistics, for all of the debate, for all of the personal examples, and for all of the outcry from businesses and staff alike, that we are still in this position. A position in which workers are feeling afraid of their place of work, worried that just by showing up for their shift, they would be putting themselves in harm's way. The sector has long been calling out for more to be done on this issue, and I am proud that Labour is a party that is willing to listen to that call. On a local level, I'm pleased that our Police and Crime Commissioner, Kim McGuinness, has been getting heads together within the retail sector and the local police forces to identify what's working and what isn't, and listening to our retail workers so that they feel recognised and supported. But there's also work to be done nationally. Labour will create a new specific offence of assault against retail workers. This is something that the likes of the Chief Executive Officers of Tesco, the Chief Executive Officer of Tesco, Jason Tarry, has called for. And using his words directly, we want our colleagues to be safe at work. Creating a standalone offence not only sends a strong message to a small but violent group of people who abuse and attack shop workers, but also makes it clear to shop workers that as a nation, we take protecting them seriously. And Labour would go further, scrapping the £200 rule, which stops shoplifting being investigated, and putting guaranteed neighbourhood patrols back into town centres with 13,000 more neighbourhood police and PCSOs. When it comes to abuse and crime that affects our shop workers, the numbers don't lie. Sadly, it's become a common practice, and when so many across the industry are calling for something to be done, their calls go unanswered. To put it simply, we need to do more to protect this workforce. No one should have to go to work in fear of being verbally abused, assaulted, or victimised for just doing their job. So I hope that the Minister will reconsider the seriousness of this situation and make this abuse a crime in its own right. That's what those people I spoke to in my constituency want. That's what the sector wants, and that is what our retail workforce deserve. I move, Mr. Lee. So
towards the retail workforce. Jessica.
Thank you, Sir Edward. Can I refer to my register of interest as a proud member of Usdaw Trade Union? Everybody deserves to be treated with respect and fairness at work, and nobody should have to carry out their job in fear of receiving verbal or physical abuse. But sadly, for many of our retail workers, this is becoming the reality. Abuse and attacks on shop workers has doubled since 2019. And my honourable friend, in an excellent opening speech, has set out the statistics. 2/3 of Usdaw members working in retail suffering abuse from customers. 25% increase in shoplifting in the last year. And the British Retail Consortium report that there are 850 incidents of violence or abuse to shop workers every single day. Shocking figures. Having to deal with violence and abuse at work has a far-reaching impact beyond the incident itself. Stress, anxiety, potential injury, of course, but also the mental health issues down the line. So I've been a supporter of Usdaw's Respect for Shop Workers Week and the Freedom from Fear campaign that they run for many years, and I congratulate Usdaw on those campaigns. Like my friend, I also visited a number of stores as part of the Respect for Shop Workers Week a couple of weeks ago. I've been engaging on this issue for a number of years. In fact, a few years ago, I remember having a meeting with retailers in Didsbury in my constituency to talk about the problems they were getting with gangs just coming in and doing shoplifting, going from store to store shoplifting, and how difficult it was for them to be able to address that. They set up WhatsApp groups and they set up communication between the various stores. They tried to contact the police, but it's a difficult problem to resolve without some kind of offence that makes it harder that makes it easier to take action against those people who are perpetrating those crimes. So it was a problem in Didsbury for some time ago. I met with trade unions, I met with the shop people, I met with the police. It's eased off a little there now, but it's in my constituency, as in many constituencies, it's a problem across the retail sector. A couple of years ago, I noticed that the shop assistants in my local co-op in Withington were wearing headsets, and I asked one of the staff there what was that about, and they said, well, because we've had so much abuse and so many people coming in giving us a hard time that we have to be able to communicate with ourselves and we have to be able to talk to the manager in the back. Tesco, so Co-op have done that in Withington, they've done it in a number of other stores. When I spoke to staff in Tesco last week, I think it was. They're doing a similar thing. They're improving their communications and improving the support that they give to their staff. And that's commendable. That's a good thing. But it shouldn't be necessary. So stores that are doing what they can, but very often retailers say that the problem is that when they report shoplifting, nothing happens. Partly to do with the reduced numbers of police and police ESOs and police staff on the streets in recent years and in our district centres, town centre patrols being cut, and perpetrators rarely being sent to court as charge numbers have plummeted. And as my friend said, fixed penalty notices for shop thefts under £200 has led to fewer crimes being investigated and prosecuted. And as a significant proportion of retail crime is thought to be linked to drug addiction, at the same time, as my friend pointed out again, drug treatment services have also been cut. Fewer uniformed officers are patrolling shopping centres and around gives criminals more confidence. It's, I think, a key factor in the increase in retail crime. And it's really disappointing that Conservative MPs have repeatedly voted down a protection of workers law, which, of course, already exists in Scotland. And there was nothing in the King's speech to tackle the epidemic of abuse against retail workers. In the run-up to Christmas, the pressure on shop workers is likely to ramp up even more. It's a busy time, it's a stressful time. And it's essential that customers treat their valued retail staff with respect. But more than that, we need legislation, we need proper police resourcing. Labour's community policing guarantee will put the police back in our town centres and our neighbourhoods, making high streets safe again, with increased patrols and 13,000 more neighbourhood police and PCSOs on the streets. And Labour would introduce a new protection of workers law, making violence, threats and abuse against retail workers a specific offence with tougher sentences. That would make it simpler for the police to take action, and it sends a clear message from Parliament to police and the public that this is being taken seriously and we will not tolerate abuse of retail workers. That measure is backed by Usdaw, of course, it's backed by the Co-op, it's backed by Tesco, the British Retail Consortium, and lots of small convenience stores. There have been numerous opportunities to back this measure in Parliament, and time after time it's been voted down. I would just request the Minister and members on the opposite benches, in the face of the overwhelming evidence and testimony from retail workers, from the retail sector, I really hope they'll think again and introduce a specific crime of abuse, making abuse and threats against shop workers a specific offence. Because if this government won't, then the next Labour government will. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Edward. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I would also like to congratulate my good friend from Blaydon on securing this debate. I would like to declare to the House that I'm a member of Usdaw, the trade union. I worked in the retail sector for 6 years myself, so I was and remain a member of Usdaw. And I'd like to refer the House to my entry in the Register of Members' Interest. In my constituency, there are 9,000 retail workers, which make up around 16.4% of jobs in the constituency. In my region, in the northwest, there are 523,000 plus retail workers. So these jobs are important jobs in my constituency in the northwest and across the UK. And I've visited, as part of the Respect for Shop Workers Week, I've visited the Co-op on Castle Street in my constituency recently. And I've done previous visits as well, where I've spoken to the managers, I've spoken to shop floor staff, and they've told me about the incidents of antisocial behaviour, violence, sometimes threats, shoplifting, and all of that. And often they feel that nothing is done about it. And what is the police doing to tackle those issues? So this is a serious matter. It does cause problems, not just for shop workers, but actually for customers as well when they have to witness such incidents. I know that the stats have been mentioned by my friend from Manchester and my friend from Blaydon regarding about 850 incidents of violence or abuse against shop workers on a daily basis. So these figures are quite high. And the recent survey by Usdaw, the retail sector trade union, had around 3,000 responses from retail workers, and it found that 65% of retail workers were verbally abused, 42% of retail workers were threatened, and a shocking 17.5% had been assaulted, and 4.8% had been assaulted just in this year. So these figures are staggering, and we do need action rather than just warm words from the government. Now, there is, I understand that this debate is about violence and abuse towards the retail workforce. I do want to add a point about the value of retail jobs. They are important jobs. Often they are low paid, they involve long hours, and sometimes they're on zero-hour contracts, and they're not seen as well-paying jobs. USDO has produced a report, a plan for the future of retail work, and it's an updated report from July this year. I'd be happy to give my paper copy to the Minister if he's interested, because these jobs should be well-paid jobs. They should be good jobs where you should be able to afford to be able to bring up your family and look after your community. But often these jobs are difficult. On top of the financial difficulties, staff face a lot of abuse. They face violence, and it does need to be tackled. And I'm sorry to say that the government has failed us on this. Not only do we not have, we do not have a specific offence for violence or abuse against shop workers. We've also seen in the last 13 years of Conservative government, we've seen significant cuts to my local force, Greater Manchester Police. Now, the officers that I speak to, I spoke to one of the senior officers in Stockport District of Greater Manchester Police just last week. They do a difficult job. They have their own issues with regards to workforce and capacity for officers, complexity of crime, rise in population, rise in crime and all of those issues. But they're often not able to support shopkeepers or shop workers or bigger stores when it comes to incidents like this. So we've seen a perfect cocktail of failure here where the government hasn't legislated. We've seen a massive increase in these sorts of crimes, but also we've seen cuts to police numbers. So we do need to address this. And the campaign, Freedom from Fear campaign, that is a campaign that runs throughout the year by USDO, the Retail Sector Trade Union, is important. There's also the Respect for Shop Workers Week, and I know the General Secretary, Paddy Lillis, was on the parliamentary estate earlier this year, and my friend from Manchester, as the chair of the USDO parliamentary group, hosted him for a meeting with MPs. I met him last week, I spoke to him about the concerns in the sector, and he was telling me that there are significant issues in the sector. So we do need action from the government. We need to make sure that there's a specific offence created. And I worked in the retail sector for almost 6 years, just under 6 years, and I had a good experience working for a large national retailer. However, I did come across incidents where perhaps the customer was unpleasant or made derogatory, racist or sexist remarks, and we do need to make sure that we legislate. The final point I'll make, Sir Edward, is that Labour has made a commitment. It's not just warm words about Jam tomorrow. Labour has made a specific commitment that Labour will table amendments to the government's criminal justice bill to strengthen the law to protect retail workers. We need that urgently, but we also need to make sure that police forces, including Greater Manchester Police, have the resources and the support they need to tackle these issues, because they do make life difficult for shop workers, but also members of the community. Thank you, Sir Edward.
Stephen Bonham.
Thank you very much, Mr Lee. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair this afternoon, and thanks also to my honourable friend for Bladen for securing this important debate today on violence and abuse towards the retail workforce. It is vitally important that we address a growing concern that is plaguing our communities and affecting the very fabric of our towns and cities, and that is the scourge of retail crime. It is an issue that cannot be ignored any longer. It's threatening the safety of our hard-working retail staff, as well as the well-being of local businesses that are indeed the lifeblood of these local communities. Shoplifting is not a victimless crime or an attack on a faceless business. It is at its core an attack on a person, an individual, and it will bring with it long-lasting consequences in many cases. A person who is simply carrying out their duties of their employment. According to the annual Scottish Retail Crime Report released last year, a staggering 100% of respondents reported experiencing shop theft at least once a day. This alarming statistic is accompanied by the harsh reality, and that is that virtually all retail staff will endure a form of abuse, violence or hate speech on a regular basis throughout the course of a day's work. Major retailers to local corner shops, the threat of violence or actual violence is never far away, and this cannot continue. Our retail workers deserve the right to be at their place of work and carry out their duties without the fear of violence, abuse or intimidation. Disturbingly, friends, violence and abusive attacks on the retail staff have nearly doubled since the pre-pandemic levels. According to the BRC's crime survey, more than 850 incidents were reported daily in the UK between 21 and 22, including racial and sexual abuse, physical assaults and threats with weapons. In Scotland, we are witness to 70 of these daily incidents, a sharp increase from 45 attacks a day in the year 2019 to 2020. So it is on the increase right across all of the UK. The economic toll of retail crime we know to be staggering too, the total cost reaching £1.76 billion in the last financial year. Customer theft alone accounting for £953 million, while retailers are having to spend additional funds, some £715 million on crime prevention measures. 100 retail CEOs wrote to 41 police and crime commissioners in England and Wales last year, urging them to make retail crime a priority in local policing strategies. The government failed to listen to them. In contrast, the Scottish Government have taken a key step forward with the introduction of the Protection of Workers Scotland Act, which fully recognises the gravity of violence and abuse against retail and shop workers. The private members' bill introduced to Holyrood received widespread support across the Scottish Parliament. It was, of course, introduced by a Labour MSP, Mr Daniel Johnson, credit where credit is due. And this proves, of course, that the Scottish Government, the SNP Scottish Government, is an open and listening governing party in Scotland, as that enacted in 2021, going through the House of Parliament in Holyrood with nobody in dissent to that, so congratulations there. Police Scotland figures reveal that nearly 8,000 cases of abuse and assaults of retail staff have been reported in the last 2 years up until August, while figures for the Criminal Proceedings National Statistics Office for 21-22, which was published in October, indicate progress is being made, with 543 of those charged under the Act receiving criminal convictions. From 2021 to 2023, 26 individuals were convicted in a Scottish court and 13 individuals have received a custodial sentence under this Act. And the Minister, I'm sure, will tell us that a specific law is not required in England and Wales for the protection of retail workers, but it is proven that with the confidence that if you report a crime, it will be taken seriously, as is the case in Scotland, and they are far more likely to go ahead and report the crimes or the racial abuse or the threats of violence that they are experiencing at their workplace to the relevant authorities. So we would ask the Minister to think again on that one. Friends, it is important that we all stand united against the tide of retail crime that is threatening our communities. We must ensure that our retail workers are safe, protected and free from the threat of violence and abuse. The Protection of Retail Workers Act Scotland is a beacon of progress, and I would urge the Minister to consider following it. And finally, I'd just like to say to all the hard-working people employed within the retail sector across Scotland and beyond, thanks again for your service every day. The outstanding service that you provided for us all throughout the pandemic should not be forgotten. We owe you a huge gratitude still, and if you do suffer abuse, racism or any threat of violence at your workplace, then please come forward and report it. Thank you very much.
Clark.
Thank you, Sir Edward, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. It's also a pleasure to be here. It's my first time across the chamber from the Minister. I'd like to congratulate my friend, the member for Blading, for securing this really important debate, and to all the members who've participated and put on record why this debate is so important. So, Edward, I spent a great many years working in retail from the age of about 14 for about 10 years. Granted, that was a very long time ago, but I don't remember it being so bad for retail workers. The impact of abuse of shop workers is far-reaching, whether that be the physical and emotional toll on those who suffer the abuse, the impact of theft on employees and retailers, and the knock-on impact of these issues on our high streets, which lose out massively when local residents say they don't feel safe in their own communities. And I want to pay particular tribute to the contributions made by the member for Whittington, Stockport, and the opposition member from Coatesbridge, Creston and Benchill. Hope I've got that right. So Edward, retail crime is a blight on our high streets and local communities. And anecdotally, it is felt by our constituents on a daily basis. But it's also born out of statistics too, which reveals horrible, worrying trends. Because levels of retail crime, violence, threats and abuse to shop workers has been increasing substantially in recent years. And my friend, the member for Bladen, set out the harrowing violence, the level of violence and assaults towards workers. Research by the Co-op shows that there have been 300,000 incidents involving shoplifting, abuse and violence in their stores alone in the past year. Figures by the British Retail Consortium, the retail trade body, show that in England and Wales, retail crime was up by 26% in 2022. This equates to a staggering 850 incidents happening every single day. That is goods being lifted and staff being abused physically or threatened with weapons. And of course, there is a cost to retailers and consumers too. The British Retail Consortium estimated that in 2021, even before the current peak in shoplifting incidents, stolen goods had cost retailers £1 billion. Talk to anyone in retail and they will tell you that behind this isn't just petty thieves. This is serious and organised crime. Criminals operating in gangs and stealing large quantities of goods and selling them. It is within this epidemic of shoplifting that retail workers are on the front line. The Co-op has estimated that in its stores it sees 1,000 cases of shoplifting a day, and this means every day 4 or 5 staff are physically attacked. They describe attacks involving syringes and knives, as we've heard from other members. This is truly, truly appalling. No worker should ever have to go into work in such fear and under attack and under the threat of attack. And I pay tribute to the Shop Workers Union, OSDAV, for their robust campaign on this issue to better protect their members. I also pay tribute to the retailers investing in anti-theft measures and better security for their stores. But shockingly, it has fallen to them to act. Because it is under this government that retail crime and abuse of shop workers has exploded. After 13 years of Tory government, over 90% of crimes are going unsolved, meaning that criminals are less than half as likely to be caught now compared to the last Labour government. More criminals are being let off and far more victims are being let down. The Tory shoplifting charter means offences under 200 are rarely investigated properly and criminals brought to justice. And of course, we have had the decimation of neighbourhood policing with town centre policing, patrols cut. The Co-ops say that in 80% of shoplifting cases at their stores, even when the offender is detained by security, as we heard from the member for Bladen, they are let go because the police are stretched so thinly that they cannot attend the scene. It is therefore no surprise that despite the amazing work of our police officers in really testing circumstances, public confidence in the police has been on downward trend since 2017, falling from 62% to just 55% in 2020. It is the first duty of any government to keep its citizens safe, and the government is failing badly. This is the abysmal Conservative record on law and order. The opposition is determined to end this chaos. Labour will not stand for any more failure to combat crime. To deliver this, we will set out Labour's community policing guarantee. First, Labour will put police back on the beat. We'll bring proper neighbourhood policing with 13,000 new police and PCSOs on our streets. This will mean more local officers embedded in and serving local communities. This will include every high street having a named officer assigned to them. Secondly, we will have zero tolerance on antisocial behaviour with repeat offenders banned from town centres. Thirdly, we will build pride in neighbourhood policing by giving local people and businesses a say in how their local area is policed and ensure there is proper career progression in the police for neighbourhood police officers. Fourth, we will end the £200 shoplifters charter, reverse the Tories' decision to downgrade such crimes and ensure we properly crack down on all shoplifting once and for all. And finally, Sir Edward, we will create a new specific offence of assault against shop workers. Everyone has the right to feel safe at work, and Labour will deliver on that promise. I pay tribute to Oslo and colleagues in the Cooperative Party who have fought so hard and continue to push for this change. After years of failure to tackle crime by this government, Labour is determined to turn the tide on rising shop theft and antisocial behaviour and make the streets safer. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Sir Edward. It is a pleasure, as always, to serve under your august chairmanship. And it's a pleasure also to follow, I think for the first time, the member for Enfield North, who I welcome to her place in the Shadow Front Bench team. I'd also like to congratulate the member for Blaydon for securing this afternoon's important debate. It follows one on the floor of the House, of course, where the opposition day debate this afternoon was on a broadly similar topic, but it's good, I think, to have a further opportunity to discuss it here this afternoon in a little more detail and perhaps in slightly less heated circumstances as well. We've heard a number of very good points made around the chamber this afternoon, which I'd like to respond to. But I'd like to start by just saying that I agree with the assessment that retail outlets are the lifeblood of our community. They're very often centres where people can go and not just shop, but also meet other people. They provide the lifeblood of communities, far more vibrant than just buying something online and having it delivered in a cardboard box to your doorstep. And I also agree that retail workers are suffering unacceptably from assaults and threats. I sympathise particularly because my very first job in South London was working in Sainsbury's, stacking shelves amongst other things, not far from my current constituency. Although I must confess, I never joined a trade union.
I should give it a go.
By contrast to the members opposite. I thank members opposite for their kind entreaties, but I think I'll probably give it a miss. But look, I think this is a serious issue, and it's one that the government is taking very seriously. Crime, of course, in general, in total, is coming down. The Crime Survey of England and Wales, according to the ONS, the only reliable measure of long-term crime trends, is for overall crime down by 10% year on year, and like for like, down 56% since 2010, which is very welcome. However, in common with other countries in the Western world, including the United States, France and Germany, we have seen a worrying increase in shoplifting and assaults against retail workers in the last year or two. It's not a phenomenon confined to the UK, as I say, it's wider than just that. And while it's welcome that prosecutions for shoplifting have increased by 29% since last year, we in government feel there is more that needs to be done. And that was responding to a number of retailers, including the Co-op and others. And that is why I sat down with the National Police Chiefs Council lead for serious organised and acquisitive crime, Chief Constable Amanda Blakeman, who's the Chief Constable of North Wales, but also the NPCC lead for this, over the summer to talk about developing a police action plan to do a lot more. And that action plan was published with the agreement of the police about 4 or 5 weeks ago. In fact, it was launched at number 10 Downing Street. And that contains a number of, I think, quite important components. The first of those is a commitment that the police will always follow up all reasonable lines of inquiry in relation to all crime, actually including shoplifting, but actually other crimes as well. It's relevant to all kinds of crime types. But shoplifting is one of the most important ones that it applies to. That means if there is evidence that can be followed up, for example, CCTV footage, the police will always follow that up. Regardless of the value of the goods stolen or anything else, they will always follow that up. And in fact, thinking about CCTV evidence in particular, in the last 6 to 12 months, the artificial intelligence algorithm that enables facial matching has become a lot more sophisticated, and so an image retrieved from a crime scene, it could be a Ring doorbell, it could be a dash cam, it could be a mobile phone, or it could be CCTV anywhere, but including in a shop. If that image is retrieved, as it should always be, using this new commitment, that can then be run through the Police National Database that contains millions of facial images from custody records. Now the algorithm is so good at matching even images that are blurred or that are partially obscured can be matched. And I think this commitment to always follow the lines of inquiry, to always run images through the facial recognition database, will lead to a lot more offenders being caught, shoplifters, but others as well. And I set a target for the police forces across England and Wales to double their use of facial recognition searches in the course of this year. So the first element, always follow all reasonable lines of inquiry, with a particular emphasis on CCTV and facial recognition. Secondly, there is a police commitment to prioritise attending in person incidents of shoplifting where that is necessary to secure evidence, where there has been an assault on a retail worker, which is obviously relevant to today's debate, and thirdly, where an offender has been detained. Now, I heard, for example, by store security staff. Now, I heard some statistics from the Co-op suggesting that where their store security staff had detained an offender, the police had only attended in the last year or so, I think in a quarter of those cases. And that, frankly, is not acceptable. And the commitment I now have, and we all have from policing, is they will prioritise attendance in all cases where an offender has been detained. And I'd like members of Parliament on both sides and police and crime commissioners to now hold police to account for doing that and delivering it. Thirdly, the plan contains a commitment to use data analytics to identify and go after prolific offenders. So identify those, often quite small number of people who are committing a very large volume of offences and specifically go after them. And then thirdly, I think it may have been the member for Blaydon who mentioned this, there is also an element of serious and organised crime in this. Organised criminal gangs who are targeting retail outlets. So there is a specific project called Project Pegasus being led by the Police and Crime Commissioner for Sussex, Katie Bourne, in partnership with, I think, about 16 retailers who are basically gathering data from those retailers, passing it to OPAL, which is the police data analysis centre for serious organised, including acquisitive crime, to identify these criminal gangs and then go after them. And that is partly funded by those retailers, but obviously supported by and organised by the police. So there are four components there. Following up all lines of inquiry, including CCTV and facial recognition, targeting prolific offenders, attending a lot more frequently, and going after serious and organised crime. And I think that package together will, of course, will lead to a very significant increase in the number of offenders who are caught, assaults prevented, and we can see that 29% increase in prosecutions go up considerably more. Of course, I give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. I appreciate the points he'd made regarding policing and meeting the Co-op. Will he give a commitment to this House that he will meet USDO, which is the sectoral trade union for retail workers, because people who are at the forefront of this crisis are the low-paid retail workers themselves?
Yes, it would seem churlish to decline such an invitation, so yes, I'd be happy to do that. But actually, he mentioned wages, and I think it was in his speech he referred to that. And I just sort of observe in passing that the minimum wage is about to go up by about 10% from next April. It's going to go up to £11.44 an hour, quite a considerable increase, well above the rate of inflation. Of course, under the last Labour government, it was only £5.93. And if you adjust for inflation in the last 13 years, and if you adjust for the increase in the tax-free threshold, the take-home wages of someone working full-time on the minimum wage is 30% higher now than it was 13 years ago, which is welcome. We also heard reference in this debate to the Greater Manchester Police. I think it may have been the member for Withington who mentioned that. And I'd like to commend Chief Constable Stephen Watson, who is doing a great job with GMP, and in fact led the way by implementing this concept of which seems like common sense, but it wasn't being universally done, of always following up all evidence. He implemented that in Greater Manchester about a year and a half ago, and it led to a 44% increase in arrests and prosecutions in Greater Manchester, and it is exactly that approach that worked under Stephen Watson's leadership that we're now applying nationwide, including to shoplifting. Sir Edward, a word or two finally on two other points that were raised in the course of this afternoon's discussion. One is in relation to the offence of assaulting a retail worker. And of course, we know in Scotland they've got a separate offence, and there have been calls to have a similar one here. Of course, assaulting a retail worker is an offence. It's assault. It could be It could be common assault, occasioning ABH. It could be grievous bodily harm. It could be grievous bodily harm with intent, etc. So it is already a criminal offence, and we did legislate, as I think the member for Blaydon acknowledged, in the Police Crime Sentencing and Court Act 2022 to make it a statutory aggravating factor where the victim is a public-facing worker. That includes retailers, but also others. And what that means is the judge, upon sentencing, is obliged in statute to pass a higher sentence than they otherwise would, recognising that the victim is a public-facing worker. Of course, I give way.
Just on that point of the inclusion of an aggravating factor, the problem is if we don't have the cases taken through to court for prosecution, then actually that aggravating factor doesn't come into play. I think what all of us are arguing is that actually the assault itself against a shop worker should be seen as a particular offence.
Well, I mean, it is obviously an offence, as I said already. It is assault. It is already illegal. It is a criminal offence. What we need to make sure is that those cases are prosecuted, the culprit is identified by the police, and they are then prosecuted. And I think the Retail Crime Action Plan that I just set out a few moments ago will result in an increase in prosecutions of those who assault retail workers, as well as those who steal from retail stores. I'm confident that will be the result of the action plan that I set out. Now, there was another point mentioned by one or two members around this £200 threshold, which I wanted just to make sure everyone is completely clear about. So there was a change made to the law in 2014, which made the theft of goods valued at under £200 triable summarily only, meaning triable just in the magistrate's court. And so it's still, so to be absolutely clear, it is still a criminal offence. It can still, and should be, still be prosecuted. And the maximum sentence is 6 months imprisonment, which is the maximum a magistrate these days can sentence. Stealing more than £200 worth of goods is triable. I think it's triable either way, meaning it can be heard in the Crown Court. And the maximum sentence upon conviction in the Crown Court for that offence, theft, I think is 7 years. So to be clear, stealing low value goods to the value of less than £200 is criminal. It can and should be prosecuted, and it's punishable by up to 6 months in prison. Sir Edward, I hope it's clear from my remarks that we are taking this extremely seriously. The increase in shoplifting in the last year or two in this country, as well as in the US, France and Germany, is of concern, which is why we're taking the action that I set out. I think we do need a zero-tolerance approach, because if we don't have a zero-tolerance approach, it just escalates. And we've seen in some American cities, like San Francisco, the situation get completely out of control, and sort of looting has become commonplace in San Francisco and elsewhere. We cannot allow that to happen in the United Kingdom. And that is why we developed this plan. It's why I've asked the police to take a zero-tolerance approach. And I'm sure all of us now, members of Parliament, as well as police and crime commissioners up and down the country, will hold the police to account to deliver the plan. I was about to sit down, but since the Honourable Lady moved the debate, it would be extremely discourteous not to give way, so I do give way.
Again, I just wondered if he could deal with that issue which I raised about resourcing of the police, because in my police area, Northumbria police area, we are still 400 police officers down, whatever the picture is nationally. And that's the same across the North East. So I wonder, and clearly that affects the response of the police. So I wonder what he can say about that and whether he can commit to increasing those numbers in Northumbria.
Well, I can confirm that across England and Wales as a whole, as I think she knows, we have 149,566 police officers as of March the 31st this year, which is a record ever number. It's higher than it's ever been in history. It's about 3,500 higher than the previous peak, which was in March 2010. So there are record numbers nationally. Now, in terms of each individual force area, the choices made by individual police and crime commissioners... I'm going to conclude here because I don't want to... overburden the committee or the House. And I do want to finish answering this point. The numbers in individual force areas obviously reflect choices made by individual police and crime commissioners over time. They reflect, for example, choices made about the precept in the past and choices made about the balance between officer numbers versus police stations and so on and so forth. What we've done in government is ensure there are record numbers nationally. We've also put more money into policing. So this year we're currently in, Police and Crime Commissioners had available to them £550 million more than last year. And in addition to that, we fully funded the pay rise, the 7% pay rise, between 2.5% and 7%, which this year entailed an extra £330 million. So those resources are going in. Now, in addition to that, from next April, we're also funding, in every police force area, including, of course, hers, all 43 forces in England and Wales, specially funded antisocial behaviour hotspot patrols, which I would expect to mainly concentrate on town centres and high streets, where obviously shoplifting may also occur. And where we've piloted those, in areas that include Blackpool, bits of Staffordshire and parts of Essex, we've, in the last sort of 4 or 5 months, we've seen reductions in 20 or 30% to antisocial behaviour and other forms of criminality. So we're going to fund each force, in addition to their regular funding settlement, to have those hotspot patrols, which should deliver in each force area something like 30,000 hours of specialist patrolling each year from April, and that I think will make a real difference.
I need to respond. Yes, I know, but I need...
Last one.
So, in relation to the explanation you've just given about the differences and the choices that local police forces have made, he will know, I'm sure, that the impact of increasing precept and the value of housing in our local communities means that authorities like mine disproportionately suffer because of the way the precepts worked out. So choices there may be, but it's choices within the funding envelope.
Well, I thank the lady for her final intervention. So I think the police funding formula, which is rather old now, does account for, I believe, the council tax base as well as population levels of crime and so forth. But that funding formula does need review and does need updating. But as I say, when we lay out the police funding settlement for next year, which we intend to do this side of Christmas, I hope police forces up and down the country, including hers, will see they are going to be getting a material resource uplift next year, as well as the special funding I mentioned to fund hotspot patrolling, which, I mean, it really has made a huge difference, a very visible public difference in the areas, I'm going to just finish, I'm afraid, in the areas where it's been trialled. So, Sir Edward, in conclusion, this is a serious issue. The government does take it seriously. We've got a plan, we've agreed it with policing, and we're now going to get on and deliver that plan operationally.
Liz Truss to sum up.
Thank you, Sir Edward. And I think this has been a really interesting debate, and one that is very important to our retail workforce who are suffering this violence and abuse, both verbal and physical. Now, clearly, I'm disappointed that the Minister has not agreed to go that step further and to agree that this should be a crime in its own right. I know that the shop workers, the retail staff in my constituency would very much welcome that recognition. And while there are clearly other forms of assault that can be used, I think this is a very specific one which needs to be addressed. So I regret that the Minister hasn't made that change, and I know that the retail staff and I will continue to push for that specific crime. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the matter of violence abuse towards the retail workforce. Many of their opinions say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stand adjourned. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding